craziest thing about God of War was that it was never supposed to happen. It was originally going to be something else entirely. Before Kratos even stepped into the Greek realms, the original blueprint of the game was heavily inspired by a completely different mythology created by a rival studio. To understand how God of War was born in the first place, you first have to understand Capcom's Onimusha Warlords. Released in 2001, Onimusha was a massive PlayStation 2 hit that essentially took the fixed camera, survival horror DNA of Resident Evil and swapped out the zombies and guns for samurai, katanas, and ancient Japanese demons. It was incredibly popular for its precise combat and atmospheric world. When director David Jaffe was brainstorming his next project for Sony Santa Monica, he was deeply playing and admiring Onimusha. As he openly stated in interviews, his initial pitch to Sony was remarkably straightforward. What if we did pretty much a similar game, but instead of ancient Japanese mythology, what if we did it with Greek mythology? His original idea was to make a game similar to Onimusha. In its earliest stages of development, God of War used many of the structural elements directly from Capcom's samurai hit. Onimusha, for example, the soul absorption system of the Onimusha inspired how Kratos absorbs souls in the game. Just as in Onimusha, players defeat demons and use a magical gauntlet to absorb their floating souls to upgrade gear. Just like in Onimusha, players defeat demons and use a magical gauntlet to absorb their floating souls to upgrade gear. Kratos was designed to collect floating red orbs from fallen enemies to level up his weapons. Also, everyone loves the fixed camera angle in the original God of War games. It was also taken directly from this Capcom classic. Instead of giving the player control of the camera, both games used dramatic fixed angles. This allowed the developers to carefully frame the action, making the environments look massive and cinematic while saving crucial processing power. David Jaffe deliberately aimed for such a feel for his game. While Onimusha provided the essential foundation, the team at Sony Santa Monica realized they needed to evolve the formula so Kratos wouldn't just be viewed as a Greek samurai clone. Several factors helped the game mutate into its own legendary beast. Jaffe wanted to move away from the claustrophobic Resident Evil feel of Onimusha because, for that game, it worked, but for God of War, it was useless. He integrated the grand environmental puzzles and seamless storytelling found in classic European adventure titles like Another World and Flashback. Onimusha was built around tank controls and waiting for the exact right millisecond to execute a precise counterattack. God of War, on the other hand, went in the opposite direction. Inspired by Conan the Barbarian, Kratos was given high mobility and his signature Blades of Chaos, allowing for much more animalistic and rage-inspired attacks that could hit dozens of enemies at once. The team aimed for a much more adult feel for the player, which they achieved. The most fascinating part of this evolution is a strange domino effect of gaming history. During the development of the first Onimusha, developers discovered a glitch that allowed players to juggle enemies endlessly in the air with their sword. Capcom thought this glitch was so funny that they spun it off into a completely new franchise, Devil May Cry. In turn, the high-flying, stylish combo system of Devil May Cry heavily influenced how the combat team designed Kratos' mechanics. By the time God of War was finally released in 2005, its identity was defined by massive boss fights, air combos, and brutal quicktime events. It had successfully removed its samurai skin, but the foundational DNA of a mythology-based hack-and-slash will always tie the ghost of Sparta directly to the demons of feudal Japan. The name God of War suits the game so much that it has become the face of PlayStation and Sony for years now. Can you imagine this iconic franchise with a completely different name? Well, it almost happened. The series features Kratos, a brutal soldier who wages a one-man war against the gods and monsters of Greek mythology. After launching on the PlayStation 2 in 2005 to widespread acclaim, the franchise exploded, spawning over 10 games across multiple console generations. Kratos himself became such an iconic protagonist for Sony that he even made cameo appearances in completely different titles, like Mortal Kombat and Shovel Knight. But when the first game was deep in development, the team was completely deadlocked on what to actually call it. The creators had narrowed it down to 3 choices, but they simply couldn't get everyone on the same page. To break the stalemate, they resorted to pure random chance. Series creator David Jaffe revealed exactly how it went down on Twitter. Actually, it was originally between 3 titles: God of War, Dark Odyssey, and At the Hands of the Gods. We could not get everyone on the same page, so all 3 went into a hat and we drew at random and agreed that whichever one we drew would be the title. Thanks Zeus, God of War came up. It's incredibly lucky that they named this God of War because I can't even imagine calling this game Dark Odyssey. God of War is a perfect, punchy title that tells you exactly what the game is about in just 3 words. At the Hands of the Gods sounds like the title of a slow-paced strategy game and completely fails to sell the idea of Kratos physically battling deities. The red tattoos of Kratos really define his character, and they are really ironic, and the way he got them was even more interesting. Within the universe of the game, that massive red slash across his body and face isn't just for intimidation. It's a deeply tragic memorial for the sins he committed. When Kratos was a young boy in Sparta, he had a younger brother named Deimos. Deimos was born with strange, dark red birthmarks across his body. Meanwhile, the gods of Olympus heard a prophecy that a marked warrior would eventually rise up and destroy them all. Assuming the prophecy was about the boy with the strange birthmarks, the gods Ares and Athena descended upon Sparta, interrupted the brothers' training, and violently kidnapped Deimos. Kratos tried to fight the God of War to save his brother, but Ares, being the stronger god, had no problem dealing with young Kratos, leaving Kratos with a permanent scar over his right eye. Driven by immense guilt and believing his brother was dead, Kratos swore to never forget him. He had a massive red tattoo permanently inked into his skin, matching the exact shape and pattern of his brother's birthmarks. The incredible irony? By tattooing himself in his brother's honor, Kratos accidentally turned himself into the actual marked warrior from the prophecy, sealing the doom of the Greek gods and setting up a vengeful journey. So, lore-wise, the red tattoo is a beautiful and tragic tribute to his family at the same time. But in the real world of game development, the reason behind that iconic red color is actually completely accidental. What no God of War fan knows is that this tattoo was originally going to be blue. Most people don't know that Kratos, during early development, originally had blue tattoos. In fact, it was only a very short time before the first God of War was released that the tattoo color was frantically changed to red. Back in the early 2000s era of PS2, Blizzard's Diablo 2 was one of the most popular and also culturally massive games on the gaming market. It featured a playable character class called the Barbarian, who happened to be a very similar-looking, bold, just like Kratos, muscular warrior covered in blue tribal tattoos. Even though the actual design of the tattoo was different, the blue color made the resemblance so strong that they had to cut this. As per the developers of the game, very late into the game's production, someone finally pointed out the similarities and that the company could sue the Santa Monica for copyright. The team suddenly realized that this could become a serious legal issue with Blizzard, or worse, that the gaming community might mock Kratos right out of the gate as a cheap copycat of the Barbarian, which obviously they didn't want because they wanted Kratos to be an iconic and unique character on his own. To avoid the controversy, Sony Santa Monica decided to completely swap the color palette, opting for the much more aggressive blood red hue in the final version. It's absolutely crazy to think that the iconic, legendary Kratos would have had bright blue tattoos if not for a random Diablo character. And I'm glad they changed it, as Kratos wouldn't look this much aggressive and brutal with blue tattoos. And hey, before we move on, how about you take a moment and subscribe to the channel? I mean, we've got plenty of videos coming that I'm sure you don't want to miss. Anyway, although the tattoos on his body are due to his choice, the reason why Kratos is so white holds a very dark truth about his past, one he can't run from. That's exactly right. Kratos' skin isn't just a stylistic design choice, it's a permanent physical manifestation of his absolute greatest sin and a permanent reminder of his tragic past. The question is, why did he get that curse? And what did he do? Long before he ever challenged Olympus, Kratos was a ruthlessly bloodthirsty Spartan commander loyally serving Ares. During a vicious raid on a quiet village of Athena worshippers, Kratos led his men in a brutal slaughter, one he will certainly never ever forget. Unknowingly, the god of war had secretly teleported Kratos' beloved wife, Lysandra, and his young daughter, Calliope, directly into the village's temple. Caught in a blind, uncontrollable berserker rage fueled by the chained blades of chaos, Kratos mercilessly slaughtered absolutely everyone inside the building. It wasn't until the blood cleared from his vision that he looked down and realized his own family was among his victims. As Kratos stumbled out of the burning temple, utterly horrified and broken by what he had just done, he was confronted by the village oracle. The oracle declared that this ash would never wash off, serving as a permanent, horrific mark of shame so that the entire world would immediately look at him and know him for the monster he truly was. This devastating event turned his skin deathly, unnaturally pale, giving him the haunting, pale, ghost-like appearance that earned him his legendary, feared title, the Ghost of Sparta. Even years later, as he navigates the freezing Norse realms of the 2018 God of War and God of War Ragnarok, you can still clearly see that faint white tint permanently stained into his skin. Though the ashes have faded slightly with time and age, they serve as a silent, ever-present bridge connecting his brutal, bloody past as the monster of Sparta to his modern, weary journey toward becoming a god of hope. But here is where the myth meets reality. If you've played the games, it's no secret exactly why Kratos has that iconic ghost white skin. We know how tragic the death of Kratos' wife and daughter is. However, the 2010 God of War comic book series dives much deeper into their backstory and provides a much more tragic end for his family. And if you haven't read it, you're missing out on a key memory that proves Kratos loved her long before he mourned her. In the God of War comic, it's revealed that shortly after her birth, Calliope had a skin disease, due to which her skin became extremely pale. In a normal society, you would just take a child to a doctor, but this was Sparta. Under Spartan law, any infant found to be weak or sickly was to be cast into the chasm of apathete and left to die. Kratos, a captain in the Spartan army, refused to let his daughter be executed by the state. Desperate to save her, Kratos sets out on a suicide mission to find the legendary Ambrosia of Asclepius, a fabled healing elixir said to cure any illness known to man or god. But he wasn't the only one looking for it. The gods had turned this search into a twisted contest he didn't see coming, with each arena backing a different champion to retrieve the ambrosia first. Kratos had carved a bloody path through terrifying monsters and rival champions, including Ulrich, the barbarian king, the same barbarian who would later return in God of War 2 to haunt Kratos. Against all odds, Kratos secured the ambrosia, returned to Sparta, and successfully healed Calliope, saving her from the chasm. It was a rare, genuine victory for a man defined by loss. However, the story doesn't end there. Years later, after the events of the first God of War game, once Kratos had ascended to become the new God of War, he remembered the source of that power. He realized that the ambrosia was too dangerous to exist. If it could heal a mortal child, it was powerful enough to potentially resurrect a fallen god. Paranoid that the remaining worshippers of Ares might try to use the ambrosia to bring their dead master back to life, Kratos returned to the islands where he found the elixir. In a final act of closure, he burns the massive tree of life that produced the ambrosia to the ground, ensuring that his enemies would stay dead and that the healing power could never be used against him. The game borrows heavily from the Greek myths, but adds its own twists to make it more marketable and interesting. A perfect example of this is the legendary Hydra. In traditional Greek lore, the Lenaean Hydra was the terrifying, venomous offspring of the monsters Typhon and Echidna, and slaying it was the famous second task of the 12 Labours of Heracles, a major plot point of the game. The classical mechanics of this mythological beast was an absolute nightmare. Every time a hero chopped off one of its reptilian heads, 2 more would violently come out from the bloody stump. To actually defeat the monster, Heracles had to rely on his nephew, Iolaus, to rapidly cauterize the severed neck stumps with blazing fire to stop the endless regeneration. And since the central main head was completely immortal, Heracles had to chop it off and bury it deep under a massive, unmovable rock. But when Santa Monica Studio needed an explosive, unforgettable opening boss fight for the 2005 God of War, they completely rewrote the history books. In the game's brutal opening act set during a raging storm on the Aegean Sea, the Hydra isn't waiting in a swampy area for Heracles to just come and kill it. It is more like a rogue terror actively tearing apart a fleet of ships. Poseidon himself intervenes from the heavens, granting Kratos the electrical Poseidon's rage magic just to help him eradicate this massive plague from his waters. The developers also made a massive visual and mechanical design shift. Unlike the myth where many heads sprout from one single body, the game's Hydra features one colossal King Hydra accompanied by several smaller spawn heads that burst independently through the wooden decks of the sinking ship. And Kratos certainly doesn't have a sidekick with a torch to cauterize the wounds. Instead of using fire to stop the regeneration, Kratos used his chained blades of chaos to physically pin the smaller heads down to the deck using heavy ship masts and rigging. For the grand finale, he brutally executes the King Hydra by repeatedly pulling its massive jaw down and impaling its mouth directly onto the sharp end of the ship's broken main mast. So why make this massive change to such a famous story? The developers deliberately shifted the ultimate glory of the Hydra kill from Heracles to Kratos to instantly establish their brand new protagonist as a legendary, unstoppable force who could effortlessly accomplish the exact same mythological feats as the greatest heroes of antiquity. It perfectly set the tone for the absolute disrespect Kratos would show the Pantheon, paving the way for the rest of the franchise where Kratos eventually encounters, brutalizes, and literally beats the actual Hercules to death with his own weapons in God of War 3. This little change set the tone of the franchise and gave the statement that this isn't just a mythology one-on-one recreation. This is something that the fans have been begging for. Old Kratos was a menace. He was known for killing gods, being a heartless god himself, and of course, doing some incredibly naughty things that you simply don't see in modern gaming anymore. Before he became a simple father, he was known for doing some crazy things. In the era of the PlayStation 2, developers were pushing boundaries to see exactly what they could get away with, and God of War decided to lean fully into the M for Mature rating to the full potential. None of the players could have imagined that a God of War would live his personal life like this. At the beginning of the second act of the original game, while Kratos is sailing across the Aegean Sea, you can find him in his private quarters on the ship. Lying in his massive bed are two women waiting for him. If you jump onto the bed, a famous circle prompt will appear above the sheets, signaling the start of a hidden minigame that none of you would like to miss. Once you press it, the camera doesn't show anything explicit. Instead, it hilariously pans over to a nearby bedside table featuring a large, ornate vase, which, to be honest, has become a famous meme at this point. As the action begins off-screen, you have to successfully hit a series of QuickTime events, pressing specific buttons in rhythm with the activities happening in the bed. As you get further into the sequence, the vase on the table starts to shake more and more violently, rattling around until the climax of the scene, where you have to furiously rotate the left analog stick. If you succeed, the vase literally vibrates off the table and shatters on the floor. The game rewards your performance with a massive explosion of red orbs the first time you complete it, giving you a significant upgrade boost early in the game. If you go back for round 2 or 3, the reward drops to a measly 5 orbs, proving that even Kratos has diminishing returns. It was a controversial, juvenile, and unforgettable mechanic that became a staple of the Greek-era games, cementing Kratos' reputation as a man of many talents. This is one of those moments that gives you a break from being a God of War to just living your personal life. The ending of God of War is my personal favourite as it serves a perfect conclusion to the game and arguably the entire character arc of the series. It stops right there. The finale is a masterclass in tragedy and triumph that begins with Kratos doing the impossible, opening Pandora's box to grow to the size of a titan and finally killing Ares, the original God of War, with the massive blade of the gods. But the real emotional gut punch comes immediately after the victory. Kratos turns to the gods and demands they finally hold up their end of the bargain to take away his haunting nightmares. In a cruel twist of fate, Athena informs him that while his sins are forgiven, no god can ever make him forget the horrors he committed against his own family. Broken and driven to absolute despair, Kratos climbs the highest mountain in all of Greece, the Suicide Bluffs, and casts himself into the Aegean Sea to end his suffering. But the gods have other plans. Athena catches him before he hits the water and levitates him up to Mount Olympus, offering him the empty throne of Ares and crowning him the new god of war. It's a powerful, melancholic ending, but there is a massive chunk of it that was famously retconned to make the sequels possible. The original 2005 ending actually featured a bizarre, non-canon montage narrated by Gaia, showing Kratos sitting on his throne and watching over every single war in human history, including flashes of the Crusades, World War I, World War II, and even modern helicopters in Vietnam. This was written because the developers honestly didn't know if they would ever get to make a sequel, so they implied Kratos ruled as the God of War forever. Obviously, God of War 2 immediately retconned this by having Zeus betray and kill Kratos within the first hour, erasing that eternal rule. However, the story surprisingly comes full circle in the recent Valhalla DLC for God of War Ragnarok. After decades of suffering, Kratos finally chooses to accept a new seat not as a tyrant, but as a god of hope, finally fulfilling the destiny of peacefully sitting on a throne that the original 2005 ending teased almost 20 years ago. Well, this was the canon ending of the game. What most fans don't know is that there are two other secret endings of the game made only for players who play at the highest difficulty. While the statue smashing video was a hilarious fourth wall break, God of War actually hides two massive lore videos, kind of endings that were originally intended to set up completely different potential directions for the franchise, and they're much darker and more cinematic than just seeing the director shout at Kratos. The first one is titled A Secret Revealed, but the fans know it better as The Birth of the Beast. To see this, you have to beat the game on Spartan mode, which is hard difficulty or even higher. And let's be real, beating the game in this difficulty is no small feat. This video explanation explores Kratos' deep family history and was so well received that Santa Monica Studio eventually turned its non-canon plot into the actual main story for the PSP game God of War Ghost of Sparta. It reveals that Kratos had a brother named Deimos, who was considered weak while Kratos was fierce. It shows their mother Callisto hinting that Zeus is their father, and ends with Deimos being cast into the underworld, where he grows strong and plots his revenge against Kratos. Unlike the joke cutscene, this was a high-budget CGI cinematic that provided deep, serious character backstory that actually mattered. The second video, however, The Fate of the Titan, is even crazier because it presents an alternate future for the universe that the developers ultimately decided not to follow. To unlock this one, you have to complete the Challenge of the Gods, a brutal series of 10 trials unlocked after beating the game. The video focuses on the Titan Kronos, who is cursed to wander the desert of lost souls with Pandora's temple chained to his back. But then it fast-forwards thousands of years to the modern day, showing a group of modern explorers and helicopters discovering Kronos' massive skeleton and the temple still rotting in the desert. It suggests that the God of War exists in all eras of human history, offering a fascinating glimpse into an urban, modern-day God of War concept that never happened. And just a heads up, if you want to see it yourself, unlocking the Fate of the Titan is the hardest task in the game. Challenge 8, where you must stay in the air killing Gorgons, and Challenge 10, with the tiny platform full of satyrs and Cerberus pups, are notorious for inducing controller-breaking rage. To get this ending, players need to complete these 10 challenges, which is honestly asking a lot because the Challenge of the Gods is widely considered the hardest thing to do in the entire original God of War. These are 10 increasingly brutal combat trials similar to the Muspelheim trials but even harder. And here's the kicker, you have to complete all 10 of them in a single sitting. If you get frustrated at Challenge 8 and turn off your console, you are starting all the way back at Challenge 1 next time. But the suffering is worth it, because completing this gauntlet doesn't just unlock that crazy Fate of the Titan modern day secret ending we talked about. It also unlocks a bunch of hilarious bonus costumes for Kratos, like the Dairy Bastard cow suit and the Tycoonius business suit. While the first 7 challenges are standard fare, mostly knocking enemies off platforms or smashing pots against a clock, the final 3 are absolute nightmares designed to break your spirit. Challenge 8 is infamous because you have to kill enemies while dealing with Gorgons who can turn you to stone in mid-air, which is an instant death sentence if you shatter on impact. The best strategy is to spam the Lance of Furies using L1 plus circle combo in the air to clear crowds, but the second you see that green freezing gaze, you drop to the ground and roll. Then there's Challenge 10, the Reach the Top trial, which is hands down the hardest part of the entire game. You are stuck on a tiny, rising platform filled with satyrs and Cerberus pups, and the platform only moves up when you knock enemies off. If you get overwhelmed, you're done. The pro tip here is the L1+X method. Jump and use Apollo's offensive to launch enemies while keeping yourself safe in the air. Alternatively, you can camp in the center and rely on perfect parries to sweep the satyrs off the edge, or even switch to the Blades of Artemis to use its heavy slam attacks to knock them overboard in one hit. And if you have the Rage of the Gods saved up, pop it right at the end to ignore enemy stun attacks and brute force your way to the top before you throw your controller through the screen. Did you know that there are also several other changes based on where you play the game? In the North American version of the original God of War, players who smashed up the final throne room discovered a scrambled phone number they could actually call in real life to hear a pre-recorded message. But for everyone playing in Europe or Japan, the developers had to change the reward entirely, leading to one of the funniest, most hilarious moments in the entire franchise. Since international long-distance calling rates in 2005 were a nightmare, the developers replaced the phone number with a secret, exclusive video cutscene that combines the audio messages into a single cinematic experience. To unlock it, you had to beat the entire game and reach the final scene where Kratos sits on his new throne in Olympus. If you had the patience to attack the two massive statues of Ares and the Minotaur flanking the throne roughly 400 times each, ideally using the Lance of the Furies combo, they would eventually shatter. Instead of the phone number, the game would immediately cut to a video where Kratos, fully in character as the new God of War, congratulates you for your immense skill and persistence. But the moment is quickly ruined when the game's director, David Jaffe, interrupts the scene to start rambling. Kratos, clearly annoyed by the mortals yapping, decides he has had enough and literally kills his own creator right there on screen. But just before Jaffe meets his demise at the hands of the Ghost of Sparta, he manages to shout, "We gotta make a sequel," which served as the very first official confirmation to the world that God of War 2 was already in development. It was a brilliant, bloody Easter egg that many American players completely missed out on, proving that sometimes region-locking content actually leads to cooler rewards. After conquering the brutal 10 challenges of the gods, if you are truly a God of War fan for punishment and decide to beat the entire main game again on God mode, the absolute hardest difficulty setting available, you are rewarded with something even rarer than a costume. In the North American version of the game, a black screen appears with a direct, unscrambled phone number, 1-800-613-8840. Unlike the comedic Secret Message 2 where the director screams at you, this call is entirely serious and provides a massive piece of hidden lore about the final boss that most fans have never heard. If you dialed this number back in the day, you would hear Kratos himself pick up the phone. In a slow, menacing monologue, he reveals that he didn't simply kill Ares, he actually captured the god's soul. Kratos explains that he keeps Ares' soul imprisoned in a small hidden chamber deep within his new throne room on Olympus, subjecting it to eternal torture by an unknown dark force. This was a huge narrative bombshell intended to set up a future where Kratos might use Ares' tormented soul as a weapon against the other gods. But the developers ultimately retconned this cool idea for the sequels, where Ares is treated as truly permanently dead. Because international long-distance laws are a nightmare, players in Europe and Japan didn't get the phone number. Their version of the game just displayed a still image while the audio of Kratos' monologue played automatically in the background. And a word of warning to the curious. While the number remained active for nearly 20 years as a cool Easter egg, it was officially shut down recently. If you try to call it today, it often redirects to a random third-party adult hotline, which is definitely not the kind of God of War content you're looking for. Orbs are the main currency in God of War, and if you want to survive the brutal climb to Olympus, you're gonna need thousands of them. Specifically, red orbs are the lifeblood of Kratos' progression. They're the mystical experience points you collect by slaughtering enemies, smashing furniture, and prying open glowing red chests hidden throughout the world. You need these to upgrade your Blades of Chaos, unlock new devastating combos, and power up magical abilities like Poseidon's Rage or the Army of Hades. But collecting them the honest way is a slow grind, unless you know about the legendary Infinite Orbs glitch hidden inside Pandora's Temple. During the Challenge of Atlas level, right after you cross the narrow bridge and survive the deadly saw room, you will find a specific undead soldier waiting at the bottom of a stone tower. Do not kill him yet. Instead, lure him over to the ladder near the wall and position yourself perfectly between the enemy and the ladder. Then unleash the specific square-square triangle combo, the Plume of Prometheus, to launch him into the air. The goal is to kill the enemy while he's hovering directly above the ladder's collision box. If you time it perfectly, his corpse will hit the ground and glitch out, bouncing back up endlessly as if caught on a trampoline. Because the game thinks he's dying over and over again, the body will continually release red orbs into a fountain of blood. Once you get the glitch going, you can just put the controller down and stand there for about 10 minutes. When you come back, you will have the maximum amount of orbs possible. 199 full red bars, which equals exactly 59,700 orbs, allowing you to fully max out every single weapon and magic spell before you even reach the second half of the game. One of the creepiest and most obscure secrets in the entire God of War franchise isn't a weapon or a costume, but a literal message from the heavens telling the ghost of Sparta to give up before he even begins. The developers at Santa Monica Studio hid this Easter egg so well that most players went decades without ever knowing it existed. It takes place in the gloomy, rainy area outside the Temple of the Oracle in Athens, right where you first meet the mysterious gravedigger, who, as eagle-eyed fans know, is actually Zeus in disguise, digging a grave for Kratos. To trigger this secret, you have to ignore the combat and look for a tiny, barely visible firefly buzzing around the left ledge near a red orb chest. If you press R2 near it, nothing happens immediately, but you have just started a hidden timer. You must then sprint back to where the gravedigger is working and stand on top of the highest mound of dirt, pressing R2 again. Finally, without wasting a second, you have to run south across the bridge and stand perfectly between the two flickering torches, pressing R2 one last time. If you hit the sequence correctly, the camera suddenly pans up to the dark clouds, and magical, glowing cursive writing burns itself into the night sky, spelling out a chilling warning: surrender, Kratos. It's a haunting, fourth wall-breaking moment where the gods, or perhaps the developers themselves, are mocking Kratos' struggle against fate, warning him that his journey is doomed before he even enters the temple. Arguably, one of the most notoriously annoying sections in the entire God of War game is the final conveyor belt hallway inside the Architect's tomb, right before you finally reach Pandora's box. This room is a nightmare design of moving floors that push you toward deadly crushes, all while harpies dive bomb you and undead archers snipe you from a distance. But speedrunners and clever players eventually discovered that you can completely break this room and turn a stressful gauntlet into a leisurely stroll. The secret relies on exploiting the game's invisible trigger zones. When you first walk into the conveyor belt area, you have to be incredibly careful to barely inch past the entrance. If you walk too far into the center of the room, you will trip the invisible wire that spawns the enemies. Instead, immediately hug the extreme left or right wall as tightly as you possibly can without stepping onto the moving belt itself. By walking toward along this razor-thin edge, you are technically skirting around the battle trigger box placed on the floor. Once you reach the first safe pedestal, you can jump onto it, and you're essentially home free. Because the game never registered that you entered the combat arena, the harpies and archers never spawn, allowing you to casually walk the rest of the way to Pandora's box without a single enemy attacking you, effectively outsmarting the Architect's final trap without drawing your blades. Ares is an absolute menace of a villain, and for a character of this stature, literally the God of War himself, it was really hard to pull off a performance that could match Kratos' intensity, but Steven Blum did it with terrifying perfection. Ares in God of War isn't just a generic bad guy or a simple villain for a boring portrayal of his character like in DC movies or in Hollywood. Here, he is more mythology accurate. He's a manipulative, towering force of nature who burns with jealousy and rage. To bring that to life, Blum had to tap into a vocal register that was simultaneously regal and completely unhinged. His performance is insane because he gives Ares this deep and vibrating voice tone that sounds like it's echoing from the depths of the underworld itself. Every time Ares speaks, whether he's mocking Kratos from the sky or whispering lies in his ear, you can hear the sheer arrogance dripping off every syllable. Blum didn't just voice him once. He returned to perfect the role in the prequels of God of War Ghost of Sparta and God of War Ascension, cementing his voice as the definitive sound of the original God of War. But what most fans don't know is that the man behind this terrifying, bloodthirsty deity also voiced one of my favorite protagonists in anime history, the ultra-cool, laid-back bounty hunter Spike Spiegel in Cowboy Bebop. It's almost impossible to believe that the same vocal cords responsible for Ares' earth-shattering roars are the exact same ones that delivered Spike's smooth, noir-style philosophical monologues. Steve Blum is one of the most prolific voice actors in history, bringing that same signature grit to iconic roles like Wolverine in the X-Men cartoons and Sub-Zero in Mortal Kombat. The only time he didn't voice Ares was briefly in God of War 3 during a hallucination sequence, where Fred Tatasciore stepped in, but for every true fan, Steve Blum is the God of War. And I gotta say, Santa Monica did one hell of a job finding iconic voice actors for these fitting characters. Motion capture technology significantly changed the gaming industry and added a sense of reality to the game that hand-keyed animations simply couldn't match. Before this tech became standard for all games, animators had to manually pose a character frame by frame, which gave games a stylized, often snappy look. But once developers started putting actors in suits covered in reflective ping-pong balls, they could record the subtle nuances of human weight, breathing, and emotion, translating that data directly onto the game's character. This was one definitive moment that changed the whole industry forever. In the original God of War, the team at Santa Monica Studio used a fascinating hybrid approach to bring Kratos to life. Most of the brutal combat you see during gameplay was actually hand-animated. This was a deliberate design choice. Kratos' attacks needed to be exaggerated, impossibly fast, and snappy to feel responsive to the player's controller. Real humans simply can't swing giant chained blades at 100 miles per hour, so hand-keying the combat allowed the animators to break the laws of physics to make Kratos feel like a god. However, when the game transitioned to its cinematic cutscenes, the team switched gears and utilized early, cutting-edge motion capture technology. For these story moments, a real actor, often the stunt coordinator, would perform Kratos' movements on a soundstage. This added a beautiful layer of grounding and heaviness to the narrative. When Kratos is just walking, grieving, or interacting with other characters in a cutscene, his movements have a realistic human weight that contrasts sharply with his hyperactive combat style. It was this blend of arcade gameplay, animation, and realistic cinematic mocap that ultimately gave God of War its unique blockbuster movie feel. With the new remake of the original trilogy announced, players are constantly asking to keep the original fixed camera angle. It makes the game much more fun and has become almost the signature style of God of War for years. This demand isn't just nostalgia talking, because that fixed cinematic camera was actually a brilliant and deliberate technical and artistic choice that allowed Santa Monica Studio to squeeze every single ounce of power out of the aging PlayStation 2. The fixed perspective did way more than just look cool. It was the ultimate optimization trick, which worked out fantastically because the camera angle was totally locked. The game engine only had to render exactly what was currently on screen, allowing the developers to fake high-quality details by painting shadows directly onto textures and leaving the backs of rooms completely unmodeled to save precious memory. If you could turn the camera around in the original game, you would see a void of absolutely nothing, because the world literally didn't exist behind you. This technique also allowed for that legendary sense of scale and spectacle, using forced wide shots to emphasize the massive sides of gods and titans like Kronos compared to the tiny ant-like Kratos, making you feel the weight of the impossible odds he was going against. Plus, David Jaffe wanted a pure pick-up-and-play experience, and a fixed camera angle meant players didn't have to clumsily juggle the right analog stick during chaotic battles, allowing them to focus entirely on landing those brutal combos. But the craziest part of this tech is the world deletion trick. As Kratos moved through a level, the game was deleting the world behind him. We didn't even notice, and building the path ahead in real time. Those long, winding hallways and slow-to-open heavy doors weren't just for atmosphere. They were actually clever, hidden loading screens designed to give the console just enough time to swap assets in and out of its tiny memory pool without ever pausing the action. While the modern 2018 reboot famously evolved this concept into an unbroken one-take camera that never cuts, it was actually just the ultimate realization of the original goal. A completely seamless cinematic journey where the camera acts more like a physical character, constantly following Kratos, ensuring that whether it's fixed in the sky or trapped to his shoulder, you never look away from the God of War and keep the fans hooked. A new God of War Amazon series is announced, and they will recreate the God of War universe for fans that don't play games, finally breaking the curse that haunted Kratos' live-action debut for nearly 2 decades. But what most God of War fans don't know is that there was originally going to be a live-action adaptation of the original game way back in the day. Yeah, it's true, but before Amazon took the reins, a live-action God of War film adaptation was officially announced by Sony way back in 2005, with heavy hitter producer Charles Roven, the man behind the Dark Knight trilogy, assigned to lead the charge via Atlas Entertainment. Despite the early excitement, the project became a textbook example of development hell. Between 2005 and 2008, a script was tossed out by David Self, and for a time, director Brett Ratner was attached to helm the chaos. Then came the wildest rumour of 2010. Game director David Jaffe revealed that the script was actually sent to Daniel Craig, who reportedly took one look at it and turned down the role of Kratos. In 2012, Universal Studios attempted to revive the corpse of this movie with writers Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan, the same guys behind Saw 4 to 7 and Pacific Rim, who aimed to humanize Kratos with a massive $150 million budget, but it never got off the ground. After years of silence, Sony officially confirmed to the New York Times in 2021 that there was absolutely no God of War movie in development. The standalone film project was effectively abandoned in favor of a live-action television series for Amazon Prime Video, which is currently in active development to give the saga the breathing room it deserves. Filming is expected to finally begin in March 2026 in Vancouver, and the casting is perfect. As of January 2026, Ryan Hurst, best known for Sons of Anarchy and ironically as the voice of Thor in God of War Ragnarok, was cast as the lead role of Kratos. With Ronald D. Moore, the genius behind Battlestar Galactica and Outlander, serving as the showrunner, and a full remake of the original Greek trilogy for the PS5 announced in February 2026 featuring the return of original voice actor T.C. Carson, it seems the Ghost of Sparta is finally ready to conquer Hollywood. There's a costume in the game that players can unlock, which also has a very funny story behind it. While Kratos is normally covered in the blood of his enemies, the Chef of Warskin reimagines him as a totally different kind of beast. This hilarious unlockable wasn't just a random gag that devs decided to put out of nowhere. It was actually a light-hearted nod to the exhausting crunch periods the development team endured to finish the game. The staff frequently worked late into the night for months on end, relying almost entirely on endless pizza deliveries to keep their energy up. So they immortalized that struggle by turning Kratos into the ultimate angry chef. To get it, you have to prove your worth by completing the brutal challenge of the gods, but the reward is worth the suffering. Once you select the costume for a new game, Kratos appears wearing a pristine white chef's hat and a blood-stained apron perfectly suited for a Greek god of war. But the best part is his weapon change. His iconic, terrifying blades of chaos are replaced by a pair of giant, heavy cast iron frying pans, which makes all of this much more hilarious. When you swing them, they make satisfying metallic noises as they bash against monster skulls. But this isn't just a cosmetic joke. The Chef of War is actually a strategic powerhouse for players who love using magic. While his attack and defense stats remain the same, this costume provides a massive 3x bonus to all blue orbs, giving you effectively infinite magic and a 50% boost to all green orbs for health. The joke was so popular that it actually inspired a legacy of food-themed skins in later games, like the Spud of War potato suit in Chains of Olympus and the Cod of War fish suit in God of War 2. The final game wasn't the complete game that the developers envisioned. It originally had many other things and levels that were cut short. And the most fascinating piece of cut content that was even David Jaffe's biggest regret is the legendary Sandstorm elevator. This wasn't just a rough concept sketch or something that was in its early stages, and they decided to scrap this idea. It was a nearly finished level in the original God of War that had to be heartbreakingly slashed at the last minute due to tight time constraints. The level was designed as a high-octane set piece where Kratos had to navigate a massive elevator composed of 2 platforms moving vertically through a steep, dangerous cliffside environment. Visually, it was stunning and likely associated with the fastest god, Hermes, as the machinery was intricately decorated with the statues of rocks, giant mythological birds. The core mechanic was pure adrenaline-based. A massive, lethal sandstorm was relentlessly chasing the elevator from below. The platform itself served as a magical safe zone that kept the swirling chaos at bay, but if Kratos was knocked off or stepped out of the protective circle for even a second, he would be instantly killed by the raging winds. The tension was designed to spike more towards the end of the section, where the two separate platforms would suddenly merge into one, causing the elevator to rapidly accelerate as the storm closed in for the kill. While this specific level was cut, its DNA survived and was redistributed into other parts of the game. The concept of a lethal sandstorm that blinds the player and limits movement was repackaged into the Desert of Lost Souls, where Kratos was to hunt sirens in the dust instead of outrunning it. Meanwhile, the insane fighting while rising mechanic was repurposed for the various elevators inside Pandora's temple, specifically the ones leading to the Challenge of Atlas and Poseidon, though those lacked the terrified urgency of being chased by nature itself. The Sandstorm elevator was so close to completion that it was actually featured in early magazine previews and press materials before the final cut, and you can still see tantalizing glimpses of it in the deleted levels featurette hidden inside the game's treasures menu, serving as a ghostly reminder of the epic escape that almost was. There are also many other pieces of cut content that never made it to the final build, but some of it wasn't cut because it was bad, it was cut because it was never meant to be played by us in the first place. This was called Test in Athens Harbor, a fascinating technical proof of concept that also served as the very first heartbeat of the God of War engine. While it's not a true deleted level in a narrative sense, this arena was the foundational testing grounds where the developers first learned how to make Kratos move, kill, and conquer. The mission here was simple but critical. Kratos was dropped into a rough, early environment modeled after the docks of Athens, and tasked with destroying exactly 30 skeletons to prove the combat loop was fun. It was basically a hit and trial basis kind of development arena where devs were still trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. But the Kratos you see in this footage isn't the Ghost of Sparta we know. Instead, it features the rare second version of the character model, a slightly more detailed, gritty warrior who lacked the final trademark ash-white skin that defines his character. You can actually still find this specific model rotting in the game's character graveyard bonus section. The primary purpose of this level was pure mechanics testing and technical benchmarking, allowing the team to push the PlayStation 2 to its absolute breaking point to see how many simultaneous enemies and how much environmental detail the console could handle without crashing or slowing down to a crawl. If you want to see this historical footage for yourself, you don't need a hack. It is openly included in the deleted levels documentary video found in the treasures menu, unlocked after you beat the game for the first time, sitting right alongside other world experiments like the original flight mechanics for the Icarus wings and some truly terrifying early Harpy designs. There are some other pieces of cut content as well which are really interesting, and one of my favorites is definitely Icarus wings. In the original development cycle of the God of War, the Icarus wings were fully functional and even modeled before officially debuting in the second game, which fans love to this day. In the first game, however, it was supposed to be there but never made it due to the tight deadlines of the game, a similar reason to all the other cut content. Unlike the restricted gliding mechanic of these wings that appeared in the second God of War game, the 2005 prototype of this was far different, and it gave Kratos much more freedom. Players could manually gain altitude and hover rather than just Kratos slowly flying. The leaked footage shows Kratos navigating a massive room with enormous floor-to-ceiling spikes, forcing the players to get past these obstacles with a level of precision flight that never made it to the final trilogy. Early HUD elements even suggested a wing meter that limited how long Kratos could stay airborne, forcing players to frantically find safe platforms to recharge. So why did they cut this amazing feature? The answer is that implementing a 3D flight system with fixed camera angles of the game created technical problems for the devs. In order to achieve this, they had to manually adjust each camera angle so that the player wouldn't fly out of bounds in the game or see the unrendered parts of the game, which players are not meant to see. Furthermore, the PS2's hardware was limited, which made it even more difficult to render large open environments, leading to texture pop-in that ruins the cinematic immersion of the game. And director David Jaffe felt it was too floaty compared to the visceral and grounded combat. Finally, when the wings returned in God of War 2, they reimagined the whole concept and re-engineered them into a gliding tool primarily used for platforming. This concept is one of those examples where devs cut it first, but surprisingly improved upon the original version of the concept. Kronos' backstory in game and mythology is one of the most tragic ones, turning the King of Titans into one of the most tragic and colossal figures in the God of War series. In the game's lore, he is the youngest Titan born to Gaia and Uranos. At his mother's urging, he overthrew his father, becoming the second King of Gods. However, his reign of the King of Gods was doomed from the very start. Kronos learns from the Sisters of Fate that he was destined to be overthrown by his own son, similar to how he overthrew his father. Paranoid and desperate to prevent this prediction, he went on a bloody rampage, effectively becoming Cannibal King, swallowing his first 5 children, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, immediately after his birth. When his 6th child Zeus was born, his wife Rhea tricked him by giving him the Omphale stone to swallow instead. Zeus was hidden and raised away in secret. Once grown, Zeus then sparked the brutal 10-year war called Great War in the mythology. Zeus eventually forged the Blades of Olympus, which he used to defeat the Titans and banish them forever. In God of War, he's the first Titan that the players encounter, and his role in the game has some interesting differences from the mythology, both in his role and in his punishment. In the game's lore, when Zeus defeats his father, he devises a cruel punishment for him rather than simply imprisoning him. He condemns Kronos to wander the desert of lost souls for eternity with the colossal Pandora's box chained to his back. He was forced to walk blindly through the storm until the spinning sands of the box crushed his bones. Kronos acts as a living, mobile foundation for the game's massive middle act. Players must summon him by blowing the Titan horn and then spend hours climbing his massive body just to enter the temple. Later, when Kratos successfully retrieves Pandora's box, Zeus banishes Kronos to the pits of Tartarus to suffer further. This would go on to give the players the most insane boss fight in the entire franchise, where Kronos then attempts to swallow the Spartan whole. Kratos, being Kratos, refuses to be digested and cuts his way out of the Titan's stomach and eventually drives the Blades of Olympus directly through his skull, ending his suffering. In the mythology, his ending is very different from the source. Unlike the creative desert punishment that Zeus gave him, forever cursing him to wander the desert, the most common myth is that Zeus imprisoned Kronos, along with other defeated Titans in Tartarus. Interestingly, some later traditions suggest a redemption arc where Zeus eventually released his father from Tartarus and appointed him as the king of Elysian Islands, the paradise for blessed souls. In myth, the reign of Kronos was known as the Golden Age of mankind, a time of total peace and abundance without labor or suffering. The game references this briefly, but chooses to focus almost entirely on his paranoid devouring of his children to justify his brutal, unredeemable fate. The Pandora box that Kronos carries also has a lot of significance and acts as a central plot point throughout the series, and it serves as an ultimate weapon for the mortals. In the God of War game canon, Pandora's box is the only object in existence capable of bridging the gap between man and immortal. Its backstory is also very tragic. After the Great War, Zeus gathered all ethereal evils born from the conflict, fear, greed, and hatred, and ordered the smith god Hephaestus to forge a vessel strong enough to contain them so they couldn't corrupt the world. He then created a massive golden chest powered by the flame of Olympus itself. When Kratos finally retrieves it and cracks it open, he doesn't just get a sword or spell. He absorbs its power to grow to a colossal size, mirroring Ares' god form and gaining the raw strength necessary to take down the former God of War. But here's the mind-blowing twist that was revealed in God of War 3. While the gods believed that Kratos used evil to defeat Ares, he actually absorbed the power of hope, the most powerful weapon of all, which Athena secretly hid in the box as a safeguard against the evils. The evils themselves escaped the box and infected other gods, which is the reason why Zeus is so paranoid and evil in the sequels. In the actual Greek mythology, the story is much more philosophical and features a famous translation error that nerds out there remember. Originally, the vessel wasn't a box at all, it was a pithos, a large ceramic storage jar used for wine or grain. The term was mistranslated into the Latin word for box, pixis, by the scholar Erasmus in the 16th century, and the name stuck forever. In the original myth, Pandora was actually the first human woman, created by Hephaestus, not as a gift, but as a beautiful evil meant to punish humanity after Prometheus stole the secret of fire. Driven by curiosity, Pandora opened the jar, releasing every bit of misfortune known to man, sickness, toil, and strife into the world. She then slams the lid, but just in time to trap one thing inside: hope, forever ensuring that no matter how much humanity suffered, they will always have the will to endure it. This entire evil versus hope dynamic is the central plot of the series. In the original God of War, the box was described simply as containing a generic power to kill a god. The writer brilliantly added the deeper layers in the sequels to explain the shift in tone and essentially give Kratos a reason to fight the entire pantheon. Have you ever wondered who exactly is the Gravedigger in the game? He first appears as a mysterious old man digging a hole outside the burning Temple of Oracle in Athens, right in the middle of Ares' chaotic siege. But if you think he's just a mortal who happened to be there, you are dead wrong. He's eventually revealed to be none other than the king of the gods, Zeus, hidden in plain sight. When Kratos first met him, he seemed normal and calm for a person amidst a huge war. He claims he's digging the grave specifically for the Spartan, warning Kratos not to die before the work is finished. This seems like absolute madness until the climax of the game. After Ares tries to brutally kill Kratos by impaling him with a massive stone pillar thrown from across the desert, he barely escapes death by climbing a rope from the ceiling of Hades, a rope that leads directly into the very hole that the Gravedigger was digging. If you see it from a different perspective, he literally provided a backdoor for Kratos to get out of. When Kratos gets out of the grave, he urges him to get back into the fight and defeat Ares. When Kratos asks how a simple mortal can know so much about gods, he smiles and says, "Athena's not the only god keeping watch on you, Spartan," before vanishing into thin air. There were clues everywhere that Zeus was this Gravedigger the whole time, but none of us ever noticed. The best clue is that both Zeus and this Gravedigger were voiced by the same person, Paul Eating. While the game never originally gives us the transformation of this Gravedigger into Zeus, a separate God of War spin-off game did exactly this. The prequel, Ghost of Sparta, which released in 2010, explicitly confirms the theory. In this game, in the Temple of Zeus, players can unlock an arena and the Gravedigger combat arena costume. When you use this costume and activate magic, the Gravedigger transforms into Zeus to blast enemies with lightning, confirming that he was in disguise the whole time. Zeus intervenes because of a divine law that forbade gods from fighting each other. Terrified of Ares' power and greatness, Zeus needed a loophole, a mortal champion who could do the dirty work for him. By disguising himself, he could guide Kratos toward Pandora's box without technically breaking the rules of Olympus. The one thing players always question is whether Kratos is actually immortal, what it will take to kill the God of War, and how he is immortal. The short answer is yes, but with some conditions, of course. He isn't immortal in the sense that his body cannot be broken or killed. Monsters, titans, and gods have successfully put him in the ground multiple times. He's immortal because he absolutely violently refuses to stay dead. And obviously, he is cursed to not die of his own hands, which we will discuss in detail. Biologically, Kratos is a demigod, the son of Zeus, who eventually ascended to full godhood. Because of this divine bloodline, he doesn't age like a normal human and has insane strength, which is exactly why he looks relatively similar despite hundreds of years passing between the destruction of Greece and his arrival in the Norse realms. But his long life isn't just genetics, it's a punishment. Kratos is famously cursed to walk the earth forever. He carries two massive curses that bind him to the living world. After Ares tricked him into murdering his own family, the village oracle bounds their white ashes to his skin. This curse ensures he can never forget his sins, but it also serves as a permanent magical mark of his infamy. At the very end of God of War 3, Kratos attempted to take his own life by impaling himself with the blade of Olympus. However, it's widely understood and heavily hinted at in God of War Ragnarok that the gods or the fates cursed him so he could never die by his own hand. Every single time he tries to end his life to find peace, the universe forces him to live on. Kratos is the comeback king, dying multiple times throughout the series. Kratos has technically died or been completely lost to the afterlife 4 separate times in the main series, and every single time, he simply treats death as a minor inconvenience and breaks right out as if nothing happened. His first descent into the abyss happened in the original game when Ares impaled him with a giant stone pillar thrown from miles away across the blistering desert. But instead of resting in peace, Kratos, being an absolute menace, literally fought his way out of the underworld, scaling a rope dropped by the mysterious Gravedigger. However, that divine assistance wouldn't last long, as his second death came directly by the hands of Zeus himself. In a brutal betrayal at the start of God of War 2, the King of Gods drained Kratos' godly powers into the blade of Olympus and stabbed him straight through the chest. He was then sent tumbling back to Hades in the underworld. Kratos was saved when the Titan Gaia, who magically healed his fatal wounds, guided him on an epic quest to find the Sisters of Fate so he could literally use time travel to reverse his own murder. His third death was the most interesting of all. During his final bloody assault on Olympus in God of War 3, Kratos plummeted in the dreaded River Styx. The cursed waters immediately stripped away his godly power and nearly soul-killed him on the spot. He only survived the drowning because he still possessed the hidden power of hope buried deep within him. Kratos being fueled by a pure, undying rage against his father that refused to let his fire go out. Even centuries later in the Norse realm, Kratos faced a different kind of passing. While not a physical death in the traditional sense, he stepped into the mesmerizing light of Alfheim during the 2018 game, effectively leaving his physical body behind. He would have been permanently lost to the blinding, tranquil light if his son, Atreus, hadn't physically pulled his body out before his soul was entirely consumed. But I think his fourth and final death was a brief, split-second one when Thor killed him in their first encounter and then revived him using his hammer. So why exactly can the afterlife never seem to hold him, and he always looks to come back? What exactly is it that makes him special? It comes down to three undeniable reasons that make Kratos the universe's absolute worst nightmare for any god of death. First is his pure, unadulterated willpower. In the God of War universe, a soul's journey in the afterlife is often determined by their state of mind. Kratos' rage and his singular sense of purpose are so overwhelmingly strong that his soul simply rejects the death state entirely. Second, the underworlds themselves are fundamentally broken because of him. Both the Greek Hades and the Norse Helheim were designed to hold the souls of mere mortals. As a god who has literally murdered the gatekeepers in both realms, personally killing Hades and hijacking the Sisters of Fate, going back in time to change his fate, you can see that the standard rules of death no longer apply to him. Finally, as revealed by the Norns in Ragnarok in the Norse era, there is no grand magical prophecy keeping him alive. Kratos is just incredibly predictable. His raw survival instincts and the relentless choices he makes to protect what he loves means he will always, inevitably, claw his way back to the world again and again, which makes him look immortal. We actually see the ultimate evolution of this immortality in the God of War Ragnarok Valhalla DLC. When Kratos enters Valhalla, he steps into a magical realm specifically designed as a place where warriors die and regrow repeatedly to test their character and resolve. Kratos dies dozens of times in this realm, but because he is a god and has truly become the master of the trial, his deaths are no longer a desperate, bloody escape from hell. Instead, he simply reforms at the door, ready to try again, having finally accepted his eternal nature not as a curse, but as a path to continuous growth. Kratos' journey throughout the game is to kill Ares and take revenge for his family, the family that was ripped away from him in the most cruel and manipulative way possible. Ares didn't just kill Kratos' wife and daughter, he created a scenario where Kratos, blinded by magically induced bloodlust, slaughtered them with his own hands inside a burning village temple. We all know Ares did this, but why did he do it? Ares didn't just do it for the fun of being evil, he had a massive, treasonous master plan. In the lore of the game, Ares had a deep, burning inferiority complex towards his father Zeus and his sister Athena. Zeus constantly favored Athena's tactical, disciplined approach to warfare and openly looked down on Ares' chaotic, mindless butchery and his chaotic approach to killing everyone. Desperate to prove his superiority and eventually overthrow the reign of Mount Olympus entirely, Ares decided he needed a weapon that the gods couldn't easily stop. Not a weapon like Blades of Chaos or any other simple weapon, he wanted a loyal servant that would do his dirty work. He scoured the earth and chose Kratos, saving him from the barbarian king and binding the searing blades of chaos to his flesh. His ultimate goal was to strip away every last bit of Kratos' humanity to forge the perfect, remorseless mortal champion. Ares believed that this ultimate killing machine by his side, he could conquer the Pantheon, starting with his direct, defiant siege on the city of Athens just to spite his sister. But while the game shows him as this grand, calculating mastermind, the actual historical lore in the Greek myths tells a surprisingly different story. Ares, as the brilliant plotting villain, is an incredible narrative invention by Santa Monica Studio. In traditional Greek myth, Ares was generally disliked by the other gods, mostly because he represented the brutal, ugly, and untamed reality of human slaughter, but he wasn't a supervillain secretly trying to overthrow Olympus. In fact, the mythological Ares was often portrayed as a reckless brute who lacked any real tactical genius, And despite his terrifying reputation among mortals, he was even known to run crying back to Mount Olympus whenever he suffered a real injury on the battlefield. He never possessed the cunning intellect, the manipulative patience, or the grandiose, world-ending ambitions to conquer the other gods. It was something the game devs decided to put in the game to add more character to him. He was simply a god who loved the chaos of the fight a little too much, completely lacking the terrifying mastermind energy that made him such an unforgettable and menacing final boss in 2005. Unlike the powerful gods, monsters, and entities we encounter in the game, Pathos Verdes III wasn't a god, a titan, or a mythological monster. He was just a mortal man. But his story is easily one of the darkest, most disturbing pieces of background lore in the entire original game. Long before Kratos ever set foot on the Desert of Lost Souls, Pathos Verdes III was a brilliant, highly sought-after engineer. His architectural genius caught the eye of the Olympian gods, specifically Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, who commissioned him for an impossible task: to design and build a massive, impenetrable fortress strapped to the back of the wandering titan Kronos. This structure would become Pandora's Temple, the ultimate vault designed to protect the god-killing power hidden inside Pandora's box. Initially, Pathos approached the project with immense pride and absolute religious devotion. But as the years dragged on in the blistering desert, the pressure of building a temple worthy of the creators of the universe absolutely shattered his mind, and it eventually changed him. He became fiercely paranoid, convinced that the gods were constantly judging and mocking his designs. His trap shifted from cleverly challenging to sadistically lethal, and his obsession with achieving divine perfection demanded a horrific price in blood. During the grueling construction process, both of his sons lost their lives. However, Pathos's fractured mind twisted this tragedy. He didn't view their deaths as accidents, but rather as necessary human sacrifices required to appease Olympus. To ensure they served the temple eternally, he decapitated his own children, turning their severed heads into sick puzzle pieces needed to unlock the deepest layers of the labyrinth. Watching her husband mutate into a monster and her children die for a meaningless building, Pathos's wife was completely horrified. She desperately tried to stop his holy crusade, cursing the gods and calling them absolute fools. Enraged by her blasphemy and terrified she would ruin his perfect creation, Pathos then stabbed her right through the chest to silence her. When the massive, deadly temple was finally completed, the deafening silence set in. Pathos looked around at the blood on his hands and realized the devastating truth at the very end, but it was too late. He had slaughtered his entire family, sacrificed his sanity, and surrendered his humanity for gods who had completely abandoned him without a second thought. Broken and consumed by hatred, he left behind a bitter suicide note expressing his absolute disgust for Olympus, and took his own life next to his wife's rotting corpse in the architect's tomb. The real genius of this hidden storyline is how perfectly it mirrors Kratos' own tragic journey, proving that the ghost of Sparta wasn't the only mortal whose life was completely dismantled by Olympus. Both Pathos and Kratos chose to serve the Olympian gods with blind, unquestioning devotion, and both men ended up slaughtering their own families while under the influence of divine manipulation or absolute madness. The most disturbing part is the incredibly dark irony of the temple's design. As Kratos finally navigates the deepest reaches of the labyrinth, he's forced to use the architect's broken family as literal tools to progress. Exactly how the gods used Kratos' own family as tools to forge him into a weapon. During his violent climb, Kratos discovers the architect's first son, who was decapitated by his father to serve the gods, and rips his skull from a box just to use it as a mechanical key. He later finds the second son, who suffered the exact same fate for the sake of the perfect temple design, left rotting deep within the brutal challenge of Hades. The horror reaches its peak when Kratos enters the final architect's tomb. There, he finds the wife who was stabbed in the chest simply for speaking out against her husband's madness, left decaying on a bed. To open the final door to Pandora's box, Kratos literally has to rip her head off her corpse. And right beside her, slumped over his desk in absolute crushing despair, is the body of Pathos Verdes himself, who committed suicide after realizing his holy mission was nothing but a cruel joke. His storyline in the game gives a mortal touch to God of War and tells how cruel and selfish the gods are, and to what extent they're willing to use mortals and others to fulfill their wishes. Kratos killed many gods and went on an absolute rampage, but he only regrets a few of his decisions, and one of them is the boat captain. While it might seem like a dark, While it might seem like a dark, running joke to the players, the boat captain is actually the series' most famous recurring Easter egg and the ultimate representation of the innocent lives Kratos carelessly took in his blind pursuit of vengeance. The nightmare for this poor NPC begins in the opening act of the original 2005 game. During the terrifying Hydra attack on the Aegean Sea, the captain is swallowed whole by the King Hydra. When Kratos eventually dives into the monster's bloody throat, the captain thinks his end has arrived. He desperately reaches out his hand for help, but Kratos just rips the master key from around the man's neck, coldly states, "I didn't come back for you," and literally kicks the screaming man down the beast's gullet to his death. But the absolute disrespect doesn't end there. Much later in the game, when Kratos is killed by Ares and falls into the underworld, he is desperately climbing out of hell and miraculously finds the exact same boat captain hanging on for dear life on a treacherous ledge. Instead of helping him the second time around, Kratos actually stabs the captain with his blades just to use his back as a temporary footstool to climb up, sending the poor guy plummeting backward into the river Styx all over again. While navigating that same underworld, eagle-eyed players can actually find a hidden note written by the captain's tormented soul, expressing his absolute pure hatred for Kratos, lamenting his cruel fate, and praying that the ghost of Sparta suffers the exact same agony. This hilarious but tragic dynamic became a staple of the Greek saga. In God of War 2, when Kratos fights the Barbarian King, the boss summons souls from hell to fight for him, and one of them is the boat captain. But unlike the other mindless aggressive spirits, the captain takes one look at Kratos, becomes absolutely terrified, and actively tries to run away from the fight. He even pops up again in God of War 3 with yet another angry note cursing the Spartan from beyond the grave. But what makes this entire saga so interesting is how it finally concludes decades later. After a lifetime of running from his past, Kratos finally reflects on his horrific actions in the Norse era. In God of War Ragnarok, during a quiet boat ride with a Mimir, Kratos explicitly brings up the boat captain completely unprompted. He openly admits that he profoundly wronged the man, expressing genuine heavy regret for the heartless monster he was back in Greece, finally giving the tortured captain the apology he deserved across multiple lifetimes. The game features an insane level of boss fights, from the Hydra boss fight players encounter at the start, to the Medusa boss fight, to multiple Ares boss fights. There are certainly no shortcomings in boss fights, but there was one specific fight cut that would have completely changed the climax of Kratos' grueling climb. This lost encounter is the legendary Harpy boss battle, affectionately nicknamed Mama Bird by the development team, and it was originally intended to be the ultimate terrifying final trial standing between Kratos and Pandora's box. According to David Jaffe in the game's deleted levels documentary, this encounter was not going to be your standard brainless hack-and-slash fight, like all the other regular ones players face. Instead, it was designed as a massive, high-stakes environmental puzzle. The setup was incredibly atmospheric. Kratos would finally reach the top of the temple only to discover a titanic, monstrous harpy fast asleep in her colossal nest, fiercely guarding both her unhatched eggs and the golden prize of Pandora's box. To wake and weaken the beast, Kratos would have to navigate a ridiculously complex arena spanning multiple floors. The brutal mechanic required the player to physically steer her massive eggs, carefully transport them across a labyrinth of moving conveyor belts and platforms, and hurl them directly into a blazing central furnace. Burning her unborn children alive would provoke the Mama Bird into a blinding, agonizing fit of rage, forcing her to crash into a vulnerable state where Kratos would finally butcher her. It was designed to be one of the most mechanically demanding segments in the entire series, forcing players to perfectly balance frantic combat with intricate timing and platforming. So why was such an epic, brutal showdown scrapped? It all came down to the crushing reality of game development: strict time constraints and technical limitations. The developers were actually full aware that the first game was feeling a bit underwhelming in its total number of massive boss encounters, but they simply ran out of time. They knew they couldn't polish the complex physics and the AI of the Harpy encounter to their impossibly high standards before the release deadline, so they made the painful decision to cut her entirely. However, the DNA of the Mama Bird still haunts the final game. Remember that notoriously annoying conveyor belt room filled with crushing grinders, infinite harpies, and undead archers? That room is the exact arena originally built for the Harpy boss, repurposed into a brutal gauntlet for the Challenge of Atlas. Furthermore, the narrative theft remained. Instead of fighting a giant bird for the prize, the final cutscene simply features a swarm of regular tiny harpies swooping in to snatch Pandora's box out of Kratos' hands the second he finds it, carrying it all the way back to Ares and setting up the Spartan's tragic death. Although we never got this boss fight, its DNA is still embedded deep in God of War's roots. God of War is a very brutal game, often featuring some scenes where players even ask how can this be possible for a video game. The franchise built its entire identity on pushing the absolute limits of the mature rating, unapologetically showcasing Kratos ripping monsters in half, gouging out eyes, and bathing in the blood of his enemies. But there is a massive difference between tearing apart a mindless mythological beast and actively murdering an innocent person in cold blood. During his grueling climb through Pandora's temple, specifically within the challenge of Poseidon, Kratos comes across a puzzle that requires him to appease the gods to open a massive door. The solution is incredibly dark. Kratos finds a terrified, screaming Greek soldier locked inside a cage. To progress, the player is forced to slowly push this cage up a steep ramp while actively fighting off hordes of enemies. All the while, the helpless soldier is begging for his life, screaming, "Please, don't do this, and what kind of monster are you?" When you finally reach the top, Kratos mercilessly shoves the cage directly into a blazing, sacrificial furnace, burning the innocent man alive to unlock the next room. It's a chilling, defining moment that proves Kratos will sacrifice literally anyone to achieve his revenge. This scene also returns as a haunting memory in the Valhalla DLC. However, this raw brutality in the first God of War game crossed a major line for international regulators. Germany's strict USK rating board flagged this specific sequence as completely unacceptable, forcing the player to actively participate in the agonizing death of a screaming, innocent human being simply to solve a puzzle was deemed too excessive, even for a game about the God of War. To avoid having the game outright banned or heavily restricted, Sony was forced to implement a major region-specific censorship patch. In the German and several other European copies of the original God of War, the innocent human soldier was completely removed from the cage. Instead, he was replaced by a generic mindless undead legionnaire monster. While this change successfully allowed the game to pass the censorship boards, it completely stripped away the dark narrative weight of Kratos' ruthless pragmatism. The hurry to implement this last-minute regional censorship was so chaotic that it actually caused unexpected delays to the European launch of the game. This wasn't the last time the franchise had to tone down its violence either. Years later, God of War Ascension faced similar small censorship issues, specifically altering a gruesome scene where Kratos stabs an Elephantor's exposed brain. But those tweaks never quite reached the infamous game-delaying status of the 2005 human sacrifice. All games have cut content, there is certainly no surprise there. Usually, rejected character models and failed concepts are quietly deleted from the servers or locked away in a developer's private portfolio. But the original God of War did something incredibly unique and hilarious with its cut content trash bin. When you finally complete the brutal campaign and unlock the treasures menu, you gain access to a literal in-game museum of failure known as the character graveyard. Instead of just showing you a boring slideshow of concept art, the developers actually fully rendered their rejected 3D models and placed them in a gloomy, atmospheric graveyard setting. You can walk around and inspect what Kratos and his enemies would have looked like before their final designs were locked in. Seeing Kratos' early iterations is absolutely fascinating. Before he became the iconic ash-covered ghost of Sparta with his striking red tattoos, developers experimented with some wild concepts. You can find models of Kratos looking like a blind monk carrying a baby, a feral warrior with dreadlocks, and even a version with blue markings instead of red. The best part is that each model comes with specific, brutally honest developer notes hovering next to them, explaining exactly why they were rejected, ranging from "he didn't look aggressive enough" to complaints about his lower half of clothing constantly clipping through his legs. But the most curious and infamous resident of the character graveyard is undoubtedly the Cyclops. The graveyard features multiple, vastly different iterations of this towering beast, perfectly illustrating just how agonizingly hard it can be for an art team to agree on a final character model. However, one specific cut detail about the Cyclops stands out above the rest. In the early stages of development, the team wanted to make the monsters feel as raw, primal, and mythological as possible. To achieve this, the original Cyclops models were originally going to be fully naked, with their weapons proudly and visibly hanging on display between their legs. The developers actually fully modeled and animated the creature's anatomy, meaning it would swing around dynamically during combat. Unsurprisingly, they eventually realized that fighting a 3-story tall monster with its junk actively flopping across the screen might be a bit too distracting for the player and an absolute nightmare to get past the ESRB rating board, so they ultimately decided to slap a loincloth on the beast before the final release. We all know he was going to have blue tattoos originally, but let me tell you a very hidden development fact about Kratos, which not many fans know. When you look at the Ghost of Sparta today, he feels inevitable, a perfect storm of rage, ash, and red ink. But Kratos actually went through the most drastic, bizarre design changes of any character during the game's early development, and his most iconic weapon, the Blades of Chaos, were born from an entirely different backstory. Before the team at Santa Monica Studios settled on the brutal Spartan general we know and love, they threw some truly wild concepts at the wall to see what would stick. One of the earliest versions of the protagonist was an elf-like character with long, flowing hair and a surprisingly soft, almost animated movie aesthetic that looks like he stepped straight out of a Disney film rather than a Greek bloodbath. Another fascinating, completely out of left field design featured a blind monk carrying a literal human baby strapped to his back during combat. The idea was to create an instant sense of vulnerability and protectiveness, but it ultimately felt too restrictive for a fast-paced action game. This is the most bizarre and outrageous one, which would have made absolutely no sense at all how a god of war can look like this. The team then pivoted to more traditional, heavy-armored sword-wielding characters, but they found them too generic and clunky. They blended in too much with standard fantasy tropes and lacked that feral, distinct silhouette. Eventually, the concept art evolved into something much darker, an escaped slave. This specific iteration of the character was designed as a prisoner who had violently broken out of his captivity, and to sell this look, the artist drew him with heavy, broken iron chains still wrapped around his wrists and forearms. While the escaped slave backstory was eventually scrapped in favor of making him a fallen Spartan captain who had a literal deal with the devil, which obviously is more badass, the developers fell absolutely in love with the visual aesthetic of the chains on his arms. They looked brutal, heavy, and punishing. That single design choice sparked a mechanical revelation. What if they attached swords to the ends of those chains? The idea birthed the legendary Blades of Chaos. The chains evolved from a symbol of mortal slavery into a symbol of divine servitude, permanently seared into Kratos' flesh by Ares himself. The entire combat system, the wide, swinging crowd control attacks that defined the franchise for over a decade, was entirely built around a leftover design element from a cancelled backstory. I bet you haven't noticed how each of the original God of Wars are released in the same month, March. Fans thought this was just a coincidence. For years, players simply assumed that Santa Monica Studio and Sony had just found a comfortable financial quarter for their blockbuster releases and stuck to a standard corporate schedule. If you look at the historical launch calendar, the pattern of the Greek era is undeniable. The first God of War game was released all the way back on March 22, 2005. The second was released in March 13, 2007. God of War 3 released on March 16, 2010. Even the spin-off games that were released around the Greek Trilogy used the same pattern, with God of War Chains of Olympus releasing on March 4, 2008, and God of War Ascension also releasing on March 12, 2013. But this wasn't just a convenient release window. The original game and its many later sequels were released in March for a very deliberate, hidden reason. It is because the month of March is historically and astronomically associated with Ares, the Greek god of war. In ancient Roman mythology, the direct equivalent of Ares is the fearsome deity Mars. The very name of the month, March, is actually derived from the Latin word Martius, which literally translates to the month of Mars. Because Mars was the patron god of the Roman military, the month of March was traditionally the time of year when the winter ice would finally thaw, and the ancient empires would resume their brutal military campaigns and go back to war. With that incredible historical depth in mind, whoever at the studio first thought to intentionally release the God of War games in March must have felt pretty smart and incredibly proud of themselves. It turned a simple corporate release schedule into an absolute masterclass in mythological marketing, ensuring that Kratos only unleashed his fury during the official month of the God of War. The main idea behind the creation of Kratos was solely focused on absolute and unhinged brutality. When game director David Jaffe was trying to conceptualize the Ghost of Sparta, he didn't look to traditional marble Greek statues, comic book superheroes, or standard fantasy knights to find his protagonist. Instead, he wanted to create a character who was shown raw, uncomfortable, and explosive aggression. To find that specific energy, he looked to Hollywood and found his perfect muse in one of the most intense performances in cinema history. Edward Norton's character, Derek Vineyard, from the gritty 1998 crime drama film American History X. If you look up pictures of Ed Norton in that specific role, the visual DNA of Kratos is immediately, almost shockingly obvious. In the film, Norton plays a violent, radicalized gang member, While Jaffe obviously wasn't adopting the character's ideology, he was completely captivated by Norton's terrifying physical presence and sheer, unfiltered hatred in the movie's first act. Norton's character features a completely shaved head, a harsh, aggressive goatee, and a lean, heavily muscled, veiny physique that looks like a coiled spring ready to snap at any second. But it wasn't just the bold head and the muscles, it was the expression. There's a specific scene in the movie where Norton's character is arrested, and he turns to the camera with a feral, unapologetic dialogue of a man totally consumed by his own rage and power. That exact look of triumph, terrifying malice, was exactly what Jaffe wanted to capture for his Spartan general. The development team took that grounded, terrifying human aggression, stripped away the modern cinematic context, covered him in the white ashes of his dead family, and included the red tattoo on his face. The result was a protagonist who didn't look remotely heroic. He looked like a walking manifestation of violence who was ready to tear Mount Olympus down with his bare hands. Why did Hades actually hate Zeus? The answers lie in the political landscape of the Greek realms. Before the pantheon was established, the three mighty brothers, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus, all teamed up to overthrow their father, Kronos, and take down the Titans in the apocalyptic Great War. After securing their brutal victory, they divided the world among themselves to rule. Zeus claimed the glorious skies, taking absolute control as the king of the gods. Poseidon took command of the vast, powerful seas. But Hades was given the bleak, rotting, eternal abyss of the underworld. And even with Hades banished to the dark to manage the dead, Zeus still constantly intervened in his matters. In the God of War series, their relationship is deeply strained and built on a foundation of general distrust. Hades always viewed Zeus as incredibly sneaky, manipulative, and entirely unreliable. While they fought side by side during the Great War against the Titans, they were eventually driven apart by Zeus's escalating chaotic paranoia after Pandora's box was opened. The absolute core of Hades' resentment in the game canon stems from a sheer lack of respect for his authority. Hades felt that Zeus, and eventually Kratos, continually disrespected his sacred domain by coming and going as they pleased, completely shattering the ancient, ironclad laws of the underworld. Kratos' treatment of Hades' realm like a revolving door was the final straw. By the time God of War 3 rolls around, this stained brotherhood turns into a full-scale war, with Hades stepping up as a major, terrifying antagonist, fighting with everything he has to defend Olympus and his own pride against Kratos and the returning Titans. This hostile dynamic in the games perfectly leans into why movies and pop culture constantly show the two brothers hating each other. Modern stories almost always use Hades as a default villain, because his dark aesthetic and association with the underworld make him an incredibly easy, recognizable stand-in for the devil or Satan figure in a classic good versus evil narrative. However, in actual Greek mythology, this couldn't be further from the truth. The mythological Hades wasn't an evil mastermind plotting to overthrow Mount Olympus, similar to how Ares is portrayed in the game. He was also much different in the myths. He was largely considered a fair and just, if incredibly stern, judge of the dead. He simply did what he was supposed to do and completed his duty, and stayed out of the petty, destructive drama that his brothers constantly caused on the surface. To really understand how much modern pop culture has twisted his image, you have to look at what his actual job description entailed in the ancient world. First and foremost, Hades was not the god of death. That specific morbid title belonged to Thanatos, the winged spirit who actually brought the end of life. Hades was simply the god of the dead. He didn't actively cause people to die or seek to harm the living. He was essentially the ultimate impartial cosmic administrator, tasked with managing souls once they crossed the river Styx. He wasn't sitting on a throne, cackling and torturing innocent people. In fact, the actual torturing of the wicked was outsourced to the terrifying Furies deep down in the abyss of Tartarus. Hades just enforced the one ironclad rule of his kingdom. Once you check in, you absolutely do not check out. But his role was even more fascinating than just being a ghostly warden. The ancient Greeks were actually terrified to say his real name out loud, which translates to the Unseen One, fearing that speaking it would draw his cold, inevitable attention. So they gave him a much more flattering, PR-friendly nickname, Pluton, which the Romans later adopted as Pluto, meaning the wealth giver. Because his domain encompassed absolutely everything beneath the surface of the earth, Hades was technically the god of underground wealth. He owned every single vein of gold, every hidden diamond, every silver mine, and all the rich, fertile soil that allowed the crops above to grow. He wasn't just the lord of the rotting dead, he was literally the wealthiest entity in the entire Greek pantheon. While Zeus and Poseidon were constantly starting chaotic wars, turning into animals and creating endless messes for mortals, Hades was the ultimate divine introvert. Aside from the famous myth where he abducted Persephone, he almost never left his kingdom. He accepted his dark lot, stayed out of the Olympian tabloid drama, and kept the universe in perfect balance. He was an incredibly strict and terrifying figure to the Greeks, but he was never an evil supervillain. He was a completely necessary, respected pillar of order in a deeply chaotic world. The original God of War didn't just test your reflexes, it tested your absolute sanity and how much you can actually endure, especially when it came to its brutal difficulty scaling. The game features 4 distinct difficulties: Mortal, Hero, Spartan, and the infamous God. But turning up the difficulty level doesn't just make the enemy AI a little smarter, it fundamentally breaks Kratos down and turns the mythological monsters into absolute menaces. When you step up to the higher difficulties, the game actively handicaps you in 3 brutal ways. In God mode, Kratos takes a staggering 5 times more damage than he does on the mortal setting. A single lazy sword swing from even a basic undead legionnaire can instantly wipe out a massive chunk of your health bar, turning minor mistakes into fatal errors and instant death. Kratos' damage output is severely nerfed. Enemies transform into massive damage sponges, meaning you can no longer just blindly smash the square button. You are forced to rely on massive, unbroken combo chains and highly strategic magic use just to clear a standard hallway. To add insult to injury, the game actively starves you of resources. You receive significantly fewer red orbs from chests and kills, meaning you have to be ruthlessly selective about your upgrades. And here's a pro tip: maxing out Poseidon's Rage early is usually your only hope for survival. Each difficulty tier completely changes the vibe of the game. Starting with the easiest one, Mortal, enemies are incredibly passive, and Kratos is practically indestructible. In fact, if you die too many times in a row on a high difficulty, the game will actually pause and mockingly offer to switch you to this mode to put you out of your misery. In the Hero difficulty, it provides the intended, balanced cinematic experience where enemies attack with a moderate, manageable frequency. Similarly, the difficulty cranks up as you scale the difficulty level up to Spartan and finally the last difficulty, God. It provides the true God of War experience, unlocked only after you beat the game once on any other difficulty. In God mode, every single encounter transforms from a mindless hack and slash into a lethal high-speed puzzle of perfect positioning, dodging, and parrying. If you notice the names of these difficulties closely, they're all named after literal ranks of Kratos' life, showing his journey from a mortal to a hero to Spartan to a literal god. But the most terrifying detail about the 2005 classic is the total lack of a safety net. Unlike the modern Norse games where you can easily pause the menu and slide the difficulty down if a boss is beating you into the ground, you can't change your difficulty mid-game in the original. If your ego tells you to start a playthrough on Spartan or God mode and you eventually hit a brick wall halfway through Pandora's temple, you are completely out of luck. You can't lower it. Your only option is to either try harder or delete your save file and restart the entire game from the very beginning. The OG Kratos had his own aura in his voice, making him unique as a character, and that raw, unforgettable energy was entirely thanks to the legendary Terence C. Carson. When the developers were casting the Ghost of Sparta, they weren't just looking for a generic tough guy to voice the God of War. They specifically chose Carson because he possessed the incredible rare ability to sound simultaneously regal but filled with rage. He brought a Shakespearean level of theatricality to the role. Whenever he famously screamed "Ares" at the sky or delivered a cold, remorseless threat to a god, you didn't just hear mindless anger. You heard the absolute agony, the shattered pride, and the commanding presence of a fallen Spartan general. His booming, aggressive tone became the defining sound of Kratos' youth, perfectly capturing the uncontrollable, explosive fury that fueled his entire Greek rampage of killing the entire pantheon. But Kratos' roaring, blood-soaked crusade needed a narrative anchor, someone who could speak for his actions, a counterbalance to ground the chaotic violence in the tone of an ancient myth. This is where the brilliant casting of Academy Award winner Linda Hunt came into play as the game's omniscient narrator. Throughout the 2005 classic, her calm, raspy, and deeply ancient-sounding voice guides the player through Kratos' darkest memories, providing an incredible juxtaposition. While Kratos was screaming and tearing monsters apart with his bare hands, Hunt was delivering the lore with the chilling, detached gravitas of a traditional Greek chorus. What makes this vocal pairing so brilliant in retrospect is how it perfectly set up the massive scope of the sequels. Fans eventually learned that this mysterious narrator wasn't just some disembodied voice reading a history book. She was actually Gaia, the mother of the Titans. The realization that the ancient Earth Mother herself was also the one quietly watching, narrating, and explaining every single swing of Kratos' blades from the very beginning added an entirely new layer of epic manipulation to the story. Together, Carson's fiery rage and Hunt's ancient wisdom formed the absolute pillars of the original trilogy's cinematic identity, one that defines the generations to come. The underworld section of the game was supposed to have some other characters, and while Kratos spent his time climbing over generic undead and a very unfortunate boat captain, the deepest pits of Hades were actually crowded with some of the most legendary sinners and characters in Greek history. One of the most famous among them is the deceitful king Sisyphus. If you know a little bit about Greek mythology, you must have heard about this character. While he didn't physically appear in the 2005 game, his canonical existence in the God of War universe is confirmed in the official God of War 2 novel. In the book, Hades is absolutely furious that Kratos managed to escape his realm with the help of the mysterious gravedigger, who we know as Zeus in disguise. In his rage, the Lord of the Underworld swears that when he gets his hands on the gravedigger, he will inflict a punishment upon him that is infinitely worse than the eternal torment he gave to Sisyphus. But who exactly is Sisyphus, and what did he do to earn such a legendary reputation for suffering? Sisyphus was the cunning, ruthless, and highly intelligent king of Corinth, originally known as Ephyra. He wasn't just a mortal who made a simple mistake. His entire life was defined by an unbelievable arrogance and a habit of brilliantly outsmarting both the gods and death itself. His rap sheet against Mount Olympus was absolutely staggering. First, he was a tyrannical ruler who regularly murdered innocent travelers and guests, which was a direct, spitting violation of Xenia, the ancient sacred law of hospitality that was personally protected by Zeus. If that wasn't enough, he also actively betrayed the king of the gods by revealing the location of a kidnapped nymph named Aegina to her angry father, simply trading the divine secret in exchange for a freshwater spring in his city. Eventually, Zeus had enough of the mortals' disrespect and sent Thanatos, the literal god of death, to chain Sisyphus and drag him to the underworld. But Sisyphus was ready. He played dumb, acting fascinated by the divine chains, and politely asked Thanatos to demonstrate how the shackles worked. The moment Thanatos puts them on, Sisyphus locked them tight, effectively taking death hostage. This caused an absolutely hilarious and terrifying global crisis. With Thanatos locked in a closet, nobody on Earth could die. Mortals were being chopped to pieces in battle and just walked away. The situation got so chaotic that Ares, the god of war, became furious that his wars were no longer lethal, and had to personally descend to Earth to free Death and hand Sisyphus over. But Sisyphus still wasn't done. Before he was finally dragged to hell, he secretly instructed his wife to leave his body unburied and to offer no funeral sacrifices. Once he arrived in the underworld, he went straight to Persephone, the queen of the dead, crying about how terribly disrespectful his wife was being. He successfully convinced Persephone to give him a temporary pass back to the mortal realm just to punish his wife and arrange a proper funeral. Once he was back on the surface, he simply refused to return, laughing at the gods and living to a ripe old age before finally being dragged down to Tartarus for good. As ultimate retribution for his sheer hubris and endless trickery, Zeus and Hades devised a special punishment. Sisyphus was condemned to the deepest pits of Tartarus and forced to roll a massive, crushing boulder up a steep, jagged hill. However, the boulder was cruelly enchanted. Right before he could push it over the peak, it magically slipped from his grasp and rolled all the way back down to the bottom, forcing the exhausted king to restart his agonizing labor for all of eternity. His legendary torment was so iconic that it actually birthed the modern phrase, a Sisyphean task, used today to describe an incredibly laborious, exhausting, and ultimately futile effort. If you played the original God of War, you absolutely remember the Harpies. They're the screeching, suicidal enemies that seem to exist solely to ruin your combos and knock you off narrow climbing ledges. But the harpies you violently ripped out of the sky in the final game were actually a massive downgrade from their terrifying original concept. In the early prototypes of the game, harpies were drastically different in both their physical design and their function in combat. Director David Jaffe originally conceived them as massive, imposing creatures that fought like flying undead legionnaires. Imagine the standard heavily armed skeleton soldiers you fight on the ground, but given giant, leathery wings and the ability to strike with heavy weapons from the air. They were meant to be full-sized, lethal combatants that required heavy, sustained combos to bring down, rather than fragile targets you could just grab and instantly tear in half. Footage of these original terrifying harpies was actually shown in early developer prototypes taking place in the Bluffs of Madness, a scrapped test level that eventually served as the visual and mechanical foundation for the massive, treacherous cliffs Kratos has to scale to reach Pandora's temple. So why were these badass flying soldiers cut? It ultimately came down to the rhythm of combat. The developers realized that filling the screen with too many heavy enemies made the fights feel like a slow, exhausting slog. The gameplay sandbox desperately needed a fast, fragile, and distracting enemy to keep the player constantly moving and prioritizing targets. To fix this, the massive winged legionnaires were drastically shrunk down and redesigned into the screeching, bat-like, annoying enemies we know today. Of course, as we discussed earlier in the video, this entire species was supposed to have a terrifying queen. The legendary cut Mama Bird boss was meant to be the ultimate giant harpy guarding Pandora's box. The brutal mechanic required Kratos to steal her scattered eggs and put them into a blazing furnace, forcing the sleeping giant into a blinding rage so he could finally kill her. While time constraints forced the developers to scrap the boss and replace her arena with the infamous conveyor belt room, in the final cutscene, a massive swarm of these annoying little pests comes in and steals Pandora's box right out of Kratos' hands, setting up his murder by Ares. Kratos had undergone massive shifts during development, some of them we discussed earlier, like the blue tattoos or the baby on the back version, but then the team went in an even wilder direction, trying to nail down his visual identity. Before they found the perfect balance of tragedy and rage and gave us this muscular Sigma version of Kratos, the artists at Santa Monica Studio experimented with some drastically different aesthetics. And oh boy, were these wildly different, many of them so far-fetched that players couldn't even imagine Kratos in those roles. One major iteration featured Kratos with long, wild dreadlocks. This design leans heavily into a tribal aesthetic, making him look less like a disciplined military general and much more like an unhinged, wandering barbarian of the Roman Empire. When that didn't feel quite right, they pivoted in the exact opposite direction, creating a version of Kratos suited up in heavy, bulky armor that closely resembled a traditional Roman centurion. However, covering him in thick metal completely hid the raw, visceral muscularity and aggressive body language that the combat demanded. They even toyed with a bizarre, surreal Silent Hill look, designing him as a masked, horror-inspired executioner, but it was ultimately deemed way too stylized and abstract for a Greek mythological epic. The design team was running in full circles, desperately trying to figure out who this guy actually was. And then came one of the most legendary and insane moments in video game history. During early pre-production, lead concept artist Charlie Wen was out at a restaurant for a casual design lunch session with the team. While sitting at the table, surrounded by food and conversation, Wen felt a sudden, massive jolt of absolute clarity about exactly who Kratos was supposed to be. The entire vision clicked into place in his mind. Using random pens and a brush pen he happened to have in his pocket, Wen started sketching right there at the table. He then ended up capturing about 90% of Kratos' final iconic design. The napkins featured the bald head, the fierce scowl, and, most importantly, the brilliant inclusion of his signature, wide-bladed weapons physically bound to his forearms by heavy, broken chains. Wen carefully gathered up the napkins, rushed them back to the office, and scanned them in, quickly cleaned up the line work in Photoshop. The second he presented the finalized digital image to the rest of the developers, the debate was instantly over. The entire team took one look at that brutal, ash-covered warrior and unanimously agreed that they had finally found the ghost of Sparta. These napkins were too precious to just throw away, so the team decided to do something different with them. The fate of the Kratos napkins is a mix of gaming preservation and tragic laundry accidents. According to Charlie Wen, a few of the napkins got lost on the way. Unfortunately, not all of them survived the trip home. Wen suspects that several of those early, rougher sketches met a very unceremonious end, crumpled up, forgotten in a jeans pocket, and completely obliterated by a washing machine, a fate not suited for the first concept art of the God of War. The idea that pieces of gaming history were destroyed by a spin cycle is absolutely hilarious, but thankfully the most important ones were rescued. Santa Monica Studio and Wen recognized that they had just captured one of the most iconic pieces of art for them. They carefully preserved the final definitive napkin sketches, the exact ones clearly showcasing Kratos' original concept art and his iconic double-chained blades. Today, those surviving napkins are cherished artifacts. They've been proudly showcased by the studio during PlayStation anniversary celebrations and shared online by Wen himself, forever immortalized as the awkward and unique birthplace of the Ghost of Sparta. There have been many great protagonists that have appeared in multiple games, but none have been like Kratos. The reason why I'm saying this is because not many characters get the opportunity to step into other games and get a crossover, and the history of Kratos appearing in other games is definitely one to see. Being the face of a massive, industry-defining franchise means you don't just stay in your own universe, you become a full-blown pop culture icon. And when you reach Kratos' level of fame, you get to appear in some truly unexpected and sometimes hilarious places. Kratos no doubt has a long, wildly entertaining history of breaking out of ancient Greece to make cameo appearances and even get parried across forms of media. Naturally, his brutal fighting style made him a perfect fit for other brawlers. He famously guest starred in the PlayStation 3 version of Mortal Kombat 2011, where his vicious, bloody fatalities felt right at home alongside Scorpion and Sub-Zero. Even the fatalities on Kratos were handled differently. You can't just throw in some over-the-top, disrespectful finisher on him. He's such an iconic character that everything about him operates on a completely different level. Built around brutality, dominance, and mythic presence rather than cheap shock value. Aside from this, he also served as one of the ultimate heavy hitters in Sony's own Super Smash Bros. Style fighting game, PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. But Kratos didn't just stick to this kind of game. He actually has a surprisingly funny, lighthearted side in the gaming world. He traded the Blades of Chaos for a steering wheel as a featured playable racer on the PlayStation exclusive title Mod Nation Races, where the Ghost of Sparta can be seen furiously drifting around family-friendly tracks in his custom Cart of Chaos. You know you have truly made it in pop culture and mainstream media though when you get officially parodied by The Simpsons. In The Simpsons game, released in 2007, players exploring the world can spot a massive, hilarious billboard featuring a spot-on parody of the ash-covered Spartan. The sign below him advertises a fake video game perfectly titled God of War. And if conquering the digital world wasn't enough, Kratos even invaded real-life convenience stores. For a limited time, to help promote the franchise, 7-Eleven actually released an exclusive bright red Slurpee flavor known as Kratos Fury, a surprisingly sweet mix of blackberry and lime. After a lifetime of being cursed by the gods, it sure must feel good for Kratos to be so universally loved that people are drinking frozen beverages named after his blinding rage. Kratos has become an absolute icon. What if I tell you an M-rated game with extreme gore has literally no swearing? Would you believe me? Well, it's actually true. In a legendary franchise completely defined by its nudity, grim narrative overtones, and the kind of over-the-top, excessive gore that made players panic in the 2000s, players are obviously not shocked to find the game earned a hard M for mature ESRB rating. If you look at the back of the original game box, you will see it listed for all expected reasons: blood and gore, intense violence, sexual themes, and, curiously, strong language. But here's the hilarious truth about that rating. If you play through the entire original Greek main trilogy, you will not hear a single F-bomb or modern curse word drop. Kratos will literally rip a monster's jaw entirely in half, gouge out eyes with his thumbs, and literally destroy an entire pantheon. But his vocabulary remains surprisingly theatrical and dignified. The script relies entirely on threats, ancient curses, and roaring visceral anger rather than cheap swears. So why on earth did the strict ESRB rating board tag the game for strong language if the Ghost of Sparta kept his mouth clean? The culprit wasn't Kratos, it was the stressed out developers. The only time any actual modern strong language can be found in the game disc is if you unlock the behind-the-scenes documentary footage hidden in the extras section. The cameras caught the developers at Santa Monica Studio dropping a few curses while dealing with the immense crunch and stress of building the game. Because those developer interviews were included on the disc, the ESRB legally had to flag the entire game for profanity. So if you ever find yourself questioning Kratos' morals while he's mercilessly sacrificing an innocent soldier or kicking a boat captain down a monster's throat, just remember, he might be a ruthless, god-killing monster, but he absolutely refuses to use foul language, and it also proves that games don't need such language to be a hit or to make the character look badass. Kronos' boss fight is hands down the most spectacular boss fight in the franchise. This was the moment when we knew that Kratos is an absolute beast that can take any enemy of any size down, and that the level design and boss fight is designed so beautifully that it left players in awe. When you finally face the Titan King in the pits of Tartarus during God of War 3, the sheer scale of the encounter completely redefines what an action game can be and pushes boundaries in terms of what can be achieved. Kratos is literally the size of an ant compared to this huge mountain of flesh, and the developers brilliantly designed the encounter so that the boss is the level. You aren't just hitting his toes, you are physically scaling his moving arms, violently ripping off his massive fingernails to break his grip, and blinding him with the head of Helios. The absolute peak of this fight happens when Kronos finally catches Kratos and swallows him whole, assuming the annoying Spartan is dead. Instead, Kratos pulls out the blade of Olympus, slices the Titan's stomach wide open from the inside out in a shower of gore, and eventually executes him by driving a massive crystal spike through his chin and plunging the blade directly into his forehead. It was a flawless execution of scale and brutality. But what makes this technological masterpiece and even more interesting is that the developers originally wanted to pull off something incredibly similar way back in 2005. Long before Kratos ever killed Kronos, he had to climb him to reach Pandora's temple in the very first game. In the final version of the 2005 original, Kratos simply blows a magical horn, and a cutscene shows Kronos obediently lowering his head so Kratos can hop on. However, the original design for this segment, internally dubbed the Mountain of the Titan, was going to be a massive, terrifying gameplay sequence. The original idea envisioned an intense, interactive chase through the Desert of Lost Souls. Instead of a cinematic, Kratos was supposed to physically run ahead of the massive, crawling behemoth. As Kronos dragged himself blindly through the blinding sandstorm, Kratos would have to actively dodge his colossal hands and sweeping attacks. The ultimate goal of this grueling marathon was to find a high enough vantage point in the desert to time a perfect, death-defying jump directly onto the moving temple chained to the Titan's back. The reason it got cut was due to several technical limitations. The PlayStation 2 engine was already being pushed to its absolute breaking point, just rendering the vast desert environment. Asking the console to simultaneously render a massive, fully animated moving Titan while handling complex collision detection and platforming mechanics would have completely melted the hardware. The developers were forced to compromise with the horn cutscene, but that original, ambitious dream of a dynamic, moving Titan level never died. They kept that exact concept locked away in their vault until the PlayStation 3 finally gave them the processing power they needed to turn Kronos into the greatest boss fight in hacking and slashing history. If you were to ask me, the most famous god from the old myths that has become famous in literature and in the normal audience's mind would be Medusa. Medusa's gaze is one of the most famous bits of lore, and how anyone she stares at turns to stone is such a famous thing that almost everyone knows it. To be perfectly mythologically accurate, she wasn't actually a god. She was a Gorgon, a terrifying mortal monster in myths who had been cursed by Athena with a head full of venomous snakes. But you are absolutely right. Her iconic, petrifying gaze is legendary, and her death is one of the most famous heroic tales of all time. However, the God of War universe decided to completely rewrite history and let Kratos unapologetically steal the ultimate glory and steal all the attention for himself. In traditional Greek mythology, the slaying of Medusa is the defining achievement of the hero Perseus. Since anyone who made eye contact with her would instantly turn to solid stone, a direct fight was deemed impossible. Perseus was gifted a highly polished mirrored shield, the Aegis by Athena. Using the shield's reflection to navigate her lair without ever looking directly at her, Perseus got close to the Gorgon while she was sleeping and then decapitated her with a divine sword. He then bagged her severed head and used it as a weapon against his enemies before eventually gifting it to Athena. This is the moment that made Perseus a hero in Greek mythology that killed the legendary Gorgon. But in the 2005 God of War game, Perseus is nowhere to be found when the time comes to kill the Gorgon Queen. Instead, Kratos encounters Medusa early in his journey through the ruined city of Athens. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, appears to Kratos and literally tasks him with killing the monster to earn his next magical ability. Unlike Perseus, Kratos doesn't use stealth. He doesn't wait for her to fall asleep, and certainly doesn't rely on a shiny mirror to avoid her gaze. He fights her head-on in a brutal, screeching duel. When he finally weakens her, he initiates one of the most iconic quick-time events in PS2 history. He violently grabs her by the snakes, slams her head against the stone floor, and physically tears her head from her shoulders with his bare hands. He then claims Medusa's gaze as his own magical spell, turning hordes of minotaurs to stone with her severed head. Since Kratos completely stole his mythological thunder and killed Medusa years before he could, what actually happens to Perseus in the game's timeline? He doesn't show up until the sequel, God of War 2, and his appearance is incredibly tragic. Perseus is found trapped in a massive bathhouse within the Temple of the Fates. He's desperately trying to reach the Sisters of Fate to revive his dead love, Andromeda. Believing Kratos is just another obstacle sent by the gods to test him, Perseus attacks. He uses the tools he should have used on Medusa, his legendary shield, his sword, and his helmet of invisibility. The boss fight is a frustrating game of cat and mouse as Kratos tries to track the invisible hero by watching his footsteps in the shallow water of the bathhouse. In true Kratos fashion, the Spartan doesn't respect the legendary Greek hero. He then beats Perseus down, shatters his magical helmet, plunges a sword from his chest, and brutally executes him by throwing him against the wall and impaling him on a heavy metal meat hook. I gotta say, the Minotaur are really unique enemy types in the game because of their different design. What makes this even more interesting that in actual Greek mythology, there was no army of bullmen. There was only ever one Minotaur, and his real name was Asterion. His origin story is essentially a punishment for a broken promise. King Minos of Crete asked Poseidon for a sign of divine right to rule, and the sea god sent him a magnificent white bull. The agreement was that Minos would immediately sacrifice the bull back to Poseidon. However, Minos thought the animal was too beautiful and kept it for himself, sacrificing a standard bull instead. To punish his arrogance, Poseidon cursed Minos' wife, Pasiphae, making her fall deeply in love with the white bull. The result of this curse was the birth of Asterion, a creature with the body of a man and the head and tail of a bull. Because the creature grew violent and required human flesh for sustenance, King Minos ordered the master inventor Daedalus to construct the labyrinth. This was a massive, incredibly complex maze designed specifically to hold the Minotaur and keep him hidden from the world. The story concludes when the city of Athens is forced to send tributes of young men and women into the maze to be eaten. The Athenian hero Theseus eventually volunteers, navigates the maze using a ball of string provided by the king's daughter, and kills the isolated beast. When building a hack-and-slash game, the developers needed a reliable, heavy-hitting enemy class to break up the swarms of smaller undead soldiers. So they took the singular Minotaur and turned the concept into a widespread species. In the 2005 game and its sequels, Minotaurs function as the standard heavy infantry of the mythological armies. You encounter dozens of them in various forms. Firstly, there are the base variants, wielding large axes or clubs, requiring players to use dodge mechanics and parries. Then there are armored variants, enemies that require Kratos to break their outer plating before doing actual damage. In later games, there are also stone and fire versions of these same monsters. The game does offer one major nod to the original myth. Deep inside the rings of Pandora's temple, Kratos gets locked in a room to fight Pandora's guardian. This boss is a massive, heavily armored undead minotaur that feels much closer to the terrifying, inescapable labyrinth monster of the original stories. You even have to use the environment, specifically firing massive wooden longs from ballistas to finally pierce its armor and pin it to the wall. In God of War 1, the infamous maze within the Challenge of Hades is notorious for being an absolute meat grinder, forcing you to hunt down and kill every single enemy before the exit door finally unlocks. But if you find yourself completely stuck or just want to speedrun the entire section, there is actually an incredibly bizarre game-breaking glitch that lets you skip the combat entirely. You do not have to swing your blades at a single monster. You can just run straight for the locked exit door at the end of the labyrinth. To pull off this sequence break, you need to stand directly in front of the locked exit and press the analog stick forward so Kratos is continuously walking into the door. While pushing forward, press the R2 button to read the text prompt on the door. Immediately after reading it, hold down the L1 button and hit X to execute Apollo's Ascension, the move where Kratos leaps into the air with a fiery uppercut strike. This is where the engine completely breaks. As you rise into the air from the uppercut, you need to keep holding down L1 and begin mashing the X button like absolutely crazy, while simultaneously tapping the R2 button over and over. Doing this exact combination of inputs confuses the game's physics, causing Kratos to slowly hover and rise higher into the air with every single press of the X button. As you float upward, you want to aim Kratos directly toward a small indentation just above the center of the door that looks a bit like a stone vent. If you keep mashing the buttons and steering him toward that specific spot, the collision detection eventually gives out entirely, and Kratos will just magically pass right through the solid door. Once you glitch through to the other side, the game simply assumes you completed the room legitimately, and you're completely free to continue on with your journey to save Athens. The funniest part about this exploit is that the broken collision works both ways. If you warp through the door, realized you missed a chest, and decide you actually want to get back inside the maze, you can just walk up to the back of the locked door and repeat the exact same button mashing process to warp right back in. The reason Ares looks so badass is 1. His voice and charisma, and 2. His sleek armor. When the original antagonist descends upon Athens, he commands the entire screen. He towers over the burning city with his flaming hair, iconic voice, and that dark, imposing spiked metal plating that makes him look like an unstoppable force of destruction. He carries a commanding presence that totally sells his status as the final villain. What if you wanted to equip Ares' armor? The developers actually let you equip this ultimate look in the game, once Kratos defeats his former master and takes his throne. To get your hands on the Ares armor, referred to in the menus simply as the God of War costume, you just need to complete the campaign on any difficulty. Once you finish the story and watch the final credits roll, the suit becomes available in the treasures menu. You can then equip it for any new playthrough, provided you are playing on the same difficulty level you just beat or a lower one. Equipping this outfit doesn't just change your look, it completely breaks the game's balance and turns the Spartan into an absolute juggernaut. Wearing this armor provides massive buffs. The damage you take is reduced by a staggering 75%. You only take a quarter of the normal damage, making you nearly invincible. Even the damage Kratos gives to his enemies is increased by 200%, meaning your standard blade swings hit twice as hard. Also, magic gain is increased by 200%, allowing your blue orbs to refill your meter twice as fast. So you can spam spells. And finally, health gain is increased by 200%, meaning every green chest basically maxes out your vitality instantly. Visually, this costume gives Kratos the full, heavily detailed regal armor seen in the game's closing cutscene, where he finally takes his seat on the Mount Olympus throne. It serves as the ultimate victory lap, letting you replay the entire tragedy while dressed as the very god you're trying to kill. To get each reward in the game, players have to complete certain conditions, such as getting the secret messages we mentioned earlier required the player to complete the game on high difficulties, and similarly, other extra items required specific conditions to unlock them. But what if I tell you that you can literally unlock each of the unlockables at the very first intro screen? It sounds like an old playground rumor, but it's completely true. Years after the 2005 release, fans discovered a massive, game-breaking cheat code buried deep inside the PlayStation 2 version. To pull this off, you actually need a second controller plugged into your console. The code itself is quite a finger workout. L3, R2, L2, R2, R1, L2, R1, L1, R2, triangle, R2, triangle. It's important to note that this specific trick really only works on the original PS2 hardware. If you try it on the later PS3 HD collection or modern remasters, it likely won't do anything. But if you have the original disc, where you enter the code changes what you get. If you start a new game, press select to open the menu, and punch the code in on controller 2. Kratos gets an immediate power surge. It maxes out all your weapons and magic spells right there on the spot. It even grants you Poseidon's Trident early, meaning you can breathe underwater from the very beginning. The only things it doesn't give you are the collectible Gorgon Eyes and Phoenix Feathers. The real magic happens if you enter the same code on controller 2 while sitting at the main menu. Doing this cracks the game wide open and grants you instant access to the entire treasures suite, which normally requires you to beat the game on the hardest settings. Here is exactly what the main menu code unlocks. You get all 5 secret outfits, and each one comes with completely broken stats that change how the game plays. Kratos gives you high magic but lowers your defense. Scuba gear greatly increases your luck and orb drops. You can also equip Kratos with the business suit, which grants infinite magic so you can spam spells, but Kratos takes double damage, and you can also unlock this Ares armor we just talked about, which required players to finish the game first to equip it. You unlock all the behind-the-scenes material we talked about earlier. This includes the character graveyard with the cut enemies, footage of the deleted Mountain of the Titan and Sandstorm levels, early concept art galleries, and a cool alternate origin story video called The Birth of the Beast. You instantly unlock the very hard difficulty setting without having to beat the game on normal or hard first. And finally, you get immediate access to the 10 trials. These are the notoriously hard combat arenas. Beating them normally is how you unlock the Chef, Bubbles, and Tycoonia skins, but the code lets you skip that headache entirely. The Minotaur boss fight is one of the hardest ones in the entire first game. Deep inside the rings of Pandora's temple, you get locked inside a massive circular room with Pandora's guardian, a giant, heavily armored undead beast. Defeating him normally is a massive test of endurance. You have to carefully wear down his health and use the room's environment, specifically a large ballista at the back of the arena, to shatter his thick metal plating across 3 separate grueling stages. However, players eventually discovered a brilliant trick that makes this battle much easier. When you finally deal enough damage to stun the beast and prompt the first armor break, you must run up the stairs and pull a large switch to fire a heavy log arrow directly at him. Here's the actual secret. As soon as you pull it, stay as close to the switch as possible and keep tapping the action button rapidly. The cinematic cutscene of the log flying across the room and hitting the beast will play out exactly as usual, but the game engine is still registering your button presses in the background. Once the cutscene with the Minotaur ends and the camera snaps back to standard gameplay, you will see Kratos already halfway through pulling the heavy switch for a second time. The Minotaur will still recover, charge the platform and strike it, causing fire to erupt and damage Kratos. But because you started the animation during the cutscene, a second log will immediately launch at the beast. This shot completely breaks his armor in one swift motion, allowing you to entirely skip the third and most difficult armor stage of the fight. If you're fed up with dying to this monster on the higher difficulty settings, using this double shot glitch easily cuts off at least a quarter of the normal battle time and saves your magic meter for the final stretch. In the very beginning of God of War 2005, you get a brief, quiet moment away from the storm inside Kratos' private cabin on the ship. Most players are just looking for the exit to get back to the Hydra fight, but if you actually stop and look around, this room serves as a detailed museum of his violent past as a Spartan general. The captain's quarters are packed with environmental storytelling that bridges the gap between his life as a human and his dark service to the gods. As you explore the cabin, you can spot several high-detail assets that prove Kratos was busy long before the main story started. Right on the floor, there's a large Cyclops skin, complete with the head still attached, being used as a decorative rug. This implies he had been hunting mythological beasts for years prior to this mission. Mounted proudly on the wall like a standard hunting trophy is the severed head of a Minotaur. Various Spartan shields and battered pieces of armor are hung around the room. These serve as quiet mementos of the mortal men he used to lead and the military battles he won in the name of Sparta. If you look over by the desk, you'll see the original standard metal sword Kratos used back when he was a normal mortal, leaning quietly against the wood. The desk also holds his personal journal, which he's seen writing in during various flashback cutscenes. The visual symbolism here is brilliant. Propping his old human sword against the wall while he now permanently wields the searing blades of chaos perfectly illustrates how he traded his humanity and traditional combat for a cursed god-given power. Of course, this room is also known for a very specific interactive element. If you jump onto the bed, you can trigger the famous button-matching minigame with the 2 women resting there. As the camera politely pans away to a shaking vase on a nearby table, completing the button prompt successfully grants you a large burst of red orbs. This is actually huge mechanical help for early game weapon upgrades, and you can even repeat the minigame a second time to squeeze out a few more upgrade points before heading back out into the rain. To truly maximize Kratos' power in the 2005 classic, you must hunt down the Muse keys hidden deep within Pandora's temple. While you only actually need 2 of these keys to unlock their massive rewards, the developers kindly designed 4 possible locations throughout the dungeon as a failsafe. If you happen to collect the required 2, any remaining Muse key chests you find will simply reward you with a nice stash of red orbs instead. Finding these keys requires a sharp eye. Your first opportunity arises during the Challenge of Atlas. After pulling the lever to make the massive statue lift to the globe, simply walk behind the statue's base to find a hidden chest. If you miss that one, the Challenge of Poseidon offers 2 more chances. While scaling the exterior cliffs under the massive chains of Kronos' back right after the rotating spiked room, you can climb all the way to the right instead of following the critical path left. Alternatively, once you grab Poseidon's trident for underwater breathing, you can break a cracked wall hidden behind some jars near a group of Legionnaire captains. Finally, the Challenge of Hades hides the 4th key at the end of the precarious balance beams over the spinning blades. Just follow the beam to the right before sliding down the exit rope. Once you secure 2 keys, you need to head straight back to the Rings of Pandora, which serves as the main rotating hub of the temple. By turning the outer wall crank, you will eventually align the room with a mural of the Muses sitting at the top of a staircase. Inserting both keys into this wall unlocks the Chamber of the Gods, and stepping inside grants you the ultimate triple bonus. Bathing in the magical sand streams provides a permanent health upgrade equivalent to 3 Gorgoneyes, a permanent magic upgrade equal to 3 Phoenix Feathers, and a massive burst of roughly 1,500 to 2,000 red orbs. That massive orb drop is usually enough to fully upgrade a sub-weapon like Medusa's Gaze right on the spot. If you're playing the HD remasters, this also unlocks the Key to Success trophy. However, there's a strict point of no return you must be aware of. You absolutely must use these keys before completely finishing Pandora's Temple. When you reach the top of the Tower of Zeus, a voice will give you a final warning. If you ignore it and step out onto the Cliffs of Madness, the temple locks behind you, and those hard-earned keys become entirely useless. It's always highly recommended to cash them in immediately after finishing the Challenge of Poseidon while you're still safely navigating the Rings of Pandora. While navigating the submerged depths of the Challenge of Poseidon, Kratos encounters a unique set of non-hostile enemies known as the Naiads. These glowing aquatic spirits are actually the daughters of the sea god himself. Unlike the rest of the monsters lurking in Pandora's temple, the Spartan doesn't draw his blades against them. Instead, swimming up to a Naiad and pressing the grab button prompts a surprisingly gentle interaction where Kratos briefly pulls them in for a kiss. This underwater detour is highly beneficial for maxing out your stats before the final act. There are exactly 4 Naiads scattered throughout these submerged tunnels, and interacting with them provides specific set rewards. If you have not yet collected the maximum cap of 18 Gorgoneyes or 18 Phoenix Feathers from chests throughout the world, these spirits will graciously fill in your missing inventory. The first and third Naiads you kiss will grant you a Gorgoneye to boost your overall health, while the second and fourth will reward you with a Phoenix Feather to increase your magic meter. Tracking them all down requires a bit of wall breaking and exploration. The first Naiad is practically impossible to miss, floating in plain sight right as you dive into the initial waters of the Challenge of Poseidon. The second requires a bit more observation, as she is safely hidden behind a cracked stone carving depicting the Naiads themselves. To find the final 2, you must progress to the save point near the massive statue of Poseidon. The third Naiad is concealed behind a cracked, breakable wall just to the left of that save point, and the fourth is waiting behind a similarly cracked wall on the opposite side, directly to the right of the grand statue. In the brutal world of ancient Greece, surviving the wrath of Olympus requires more than just swinging a pair of chained blades. To cast devastating spells like Poseidon's Rage or Medusa's Gaze, Kratos needs a massive reservoir of magical energy. This is where the mythical Phoenix Feathers come into play. In Greek lore, the Phoenix is a magnificent firebird that cyclically regenerates, bursting into flames and rising reborn from its own ashes. Capturing the essence of this endless endurance, the developers scattered these glowing blue feathers in unmarked chests hidden throughout the environment. To actually see a benefit, players need to hunt these treasures down systematically. Collecting exactly 6 Phoenix Feathers permanently extends Kratos' blue magic meter, allowing him to cast more spells during a fight before needing a recharge. With a hard cap of 18 feathers available to collect, a diligent player can secure a total of 3 massive upgrades to their magical capacity over the course of the campaign. However, the level designers at Santa Monica Studio were surprisingly forgiving when it came to hiding these crucial items. Recognizing that most players wouldn't check every single dark corner or breakable wall, they placed far more than 18 feather chests throughout the world as a built-in failsafe. If you were meticulous and managed to collect the maximum 18 feathers early in the game, the system actively rewards your exploration. Any subsequent chest you open that was programmed to hold a Phoenix Feather will instead burst with a massive shower of red orbs. By hunting these feathers down as soon as possible, you essentially convert the late-game chests into a highly lucrative funding source, giving you the exact currency needed to max out your weapons before facing the final gauntlet. During the intense development of the original God of War, Santa Monica Studio brainstormed dozens of brutal traps and environments that ultimately had to be left on the cutting room floor. If you dig through the game's behind-the-scenes materials, you will find one of the most intriguing scrapped concepts, a prototype level simply known as the Ever-Changing Maze. Unlike the static, enemy-filled maze inside the Challenge of Hades, this cut prototype was designed to be a living mechanical puzzle where the architecture itself was actively working against the Spartan. Picture Kratos stepping into a massive room where the corridors are constantly shifting. The massive stone walls were rigged to a strict rhythmic timer. They would lift high into the ceiling for just a few frantic seconds, briefly revealing a temporary path forward before violently slamming back down to the floor. To survive this gauntlet, players would have to memorize the shifting architectural patterns, time Kratos' sprints perfectly, and likely fend off monsters simultaneously to ensure you didn't get trapped or instantly crushed by the descending stone. While it sounds like a thrilling, high-stakes concept on paper, it is very easy to see why the directors eventually decided to scrap it. Waiting around for timed walls to lift completely breaks the fast, fluid momentum of Kratos' signature hack-and-slash combat. The development team likely realized that forcing players to stand still and watch a timer would end up feeling significantly more frustrating than fun. Instead of a slow, shifting maze, those mechanical puzzle concepts were heavily refined and eventually turned into the brutal, fast-paced, spiked floor rooms and crushing block traps that made it into the final version of Pandora's Temple. No doubt the most fascinating parts of the original God of War were its cut content and what the studio used to replace them with. And that's it guys for God of War's original trilogy. If you enjoyed this one and want to watch another video, I suggest watching 2 hours of God of War Ragnarok Facts video that's on your screen right now. Click on it and I'll see you there.